And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to have everyone here. Such a great crowd already. And we're doing something very special tonight because we are breaking some real news on this episode relating to the time capsule coverage that I've put forward here over the last, say, 6 months or so inside of the X series. And we're going deep with the tie-in to the X Steganography. We've kind of come across a point in the research that is going to bring a number of these factors together, and that's very exciting. Of course, as usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia is going to be taking your questions tonight. She's going to be looking for them in the second half of the program. You can ask them now. Make sure that they're all in caps, and that makes it nice and easy for them to be found. I have to say that last night's show that we had, which was an interesting show dealing with the whole controversies around the secret space program with Cliff High, was a fantastic show and just a great turnout, and people really...
Yeah, the term is epic.
Epic, that's it. And I think Cliff really was at his top game, and we really appreciate that. It's fantastic to have everyone back here tonight. A couple of things I want to mention right up front, which is that tonight we're going to go very deep into the 19th century to the 20th century to the 21st century, and I'm going to string them together using the X Steganography, and we're going to get very deep in that process. So when you find on one hand that I'm bringing up Goethe on one side and former President Nixon on the other, these things are going to look like they don't congeal, but by the end of the program, you're going to be like me there with your jaw dropping at some of the things that we've run across. And the other thing I want to mention is that, when we look at some of these figures through history, we get a much better feel for the political side of things if we understand the mystery school activity and their incredible influence on some of those deeper political factors. So when we look at groups like Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy or Blavatsky's theosophy, we don't really get the full impact unless we look at their social impact, political impact, financial, spiritual impact. They go much further beyond just the kind of public mystery schools that they are and that they were designed to be. And then, as we know, because they're public mystery schools, the real deeper strains of those mystery schools are completely underground, which there's a line that I bring up in this program very often that Gurdjieff said, which is what to do is always public. For example, in a religion, they tell us what to do, turn the other cheek, for example. But the how to do it stays hidden. And what we're after in this episode and on this show is the how to do it. And that part stays hidden because it gets persecuted when it is brought out into the public. And over again, it's driven underground and resurfaces in different ways. So I think we get kind of a better idea of the mysteries that we're dealing with on the political spectrum when we take this mystery school legacy, I guess is the best way to refer to it, into account. And some of the best known mystery schools, of course, would be the Rosicrucians, and comes out of this kind of Hermetic tradition. But the Rosicrucians are really going to form a key role tonight because we're going to be bringing in the Georgia Guidestones into the X series tonight. And one of the big breakthroughs we've found is related directly to the Georgia Guidestones. Let's meet a few people. One of the major influences on Rudolf Steiner, I have a picture of Steiner, the head of anthroposophy, here as a younger man. And boy, I have a lot of pictures for you guys tonight. This is Steiner there he was just about 19, and he met a very interesting figure during this period. But Steiner would go on to become a really powerful European member of the Theosophical Society, and he ran the entire German branch before breaking off from it. And really what happened here, and how this relates to the X Steganography, is that when Steiner goes his own way and forms anthroposophy, he's moving in a very Western esoteric tradition, which is where we're going to find the X over and over again. The Eastern traditions that are celebrated by Theosophy eventually, that didn't really start off that way, but that break there literally is Eastern initiators versus Western initiators. The fundamental idea behind anthroposophy on this is that there's a crucial thing that Western esotericism needs to bring forward in this period of time, and that the Eastern initiators and the Eastern tradition has brought us to the point to do it. But because there have been so many sort of problems with this rollout, let's say, a lot of the Eastern initiators are kind of nervous on the trigger and coming forward and trying to play the Eastern way again for society and for the culture to move forward. And in Steiner's assessment, that was going to doomed to failure, because basically the Eastern aspect had set up the conditions. And so the Western mystery tradition needed to walk through the door and set up the future. And this is where the clash came. But Steiner is a transformative figure, and he comes in very crucial when we're dealing with these aspects, getting into tonight the time capsule aspects that we've covered on this program, moving into that mystery X Steganography that we see through so many mystery school traditions, and then eventually into the United States government and the secrecy, moving from program to program. Another very important figure for Steiner was this man, Goethe. And Goethe is celebrated as a poet, as a naturalist, as a real Renaissance man, and of his era, and particularly brought to prominence by his book, The Green Snake and the Lily. There's so many esoteric truths embedded in his work, and he is such a kind of advanced person from the anthroposophical point of view, that the stream of his breakthrough in spirituality is what fuels so much of what comes after. But he's a very crucial figure. This figure, Furcher von Steinmund, is also going to be very important tonight. You may not have heard of him. He's not on that level in American culture where we would know, but buried there deep in German culture, he's quite celebrated as a poet and somebody on that level with Goethe. And they're both going to play a very crucial part as we roll out through the evening here. Now, one thing I want to mention is in relation to where the X Steganography comes from and why these figures are going to be important in pulling this picture together. The X Steganography, which I've found over and over again in linking back to the mystery schools, all the way back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead and beyond, is that there's a code there which is embodied in the symbol X, which relates to a mystery tradition about something that took place. And the way that I've laid it out in my own analysis is that it relates to this destruction of Atlantis, this period of transformation, which we think of now as a kind of, earthquake, and I'm sure all that's true, but there's something about it which is almost like a spiritual earthquake that takes place back there. And there are other traditions and other legends about this. So I've decided that the term for it that I'm using this program is Apotheum. And it is this kind of uncontrollable thing that takes place that completely transforms the lives of the people back there. And they keep this tradition going about what it was that caused that through these different eras using X Steganography throughout. And we've demonstrated that here in over 34 episodes. And we're on episode 34 here. This is very interesting. This is something that the Theosophical Society did, which was an X ceremony. This is Annie Besant here, who would vouchsafe John Keely's technology as a member of Theosophy and keep it away from greedy corporate profiteers, and Colonel Olcott, who also was another foundational member of Theosophy. They had such an incredible impact on the politics of their day, even though they're remembered now largely for their spiritual role. Really, much of the home rule of India relates directly to the work of Annie Besant and Colonel Olcott, who were put into position by running across a Blavatsky, who literally had come directly out of this mystery school tradition and was instructed to start the Theosophical Society. Now, the conditions in that period of time, which is 1875, when Blavatsky came forward to do this, I should have a picture of her handy. I'm sure I will before
we all know what she looks like.
Very powerful eyes. But what Steiner refers to in this period is kind of the war of the mystery schools. And I've demonstrated it on this program in the work of C.G. Harrison also. And his book, The Transcendental Universe, is basically a blow-by-blow of that battle. And it's highly recommended little book of 5 lectures. But what happens there is very interesting, because according to Steiner, the mystery schools were looking at a situation coming in, which was that spiritual materialism had reached such a peak so fast, it had moved ahead so fast, that the mystery schools were going to be put in a position of letting out truths that had been hidden through the ages to humanity, and worrying about the kind of effects it would have on humanity and if humanity was ready for it. But they had to do it because a small group in there was looking out into the future, and they said, over the course of time, in about 80 to 100 years, we're not going to recognize humanity. They're going to become so mechanized that they won't have a chance, basically, against this onslaught of what Steiner refers to as harmonic forces, which fundamentally is just a heavy scientific materialism vibe. So some of those groups came forward and said, we're going to go out and do this. And this is where this wave of spiritualism comes from. According to Steiner, it was an act of desperation, in a sense, on the part of the military schools to get the conversation back to people's spirituality. And there were a number of things wrong with the initial rollout. One of the things that happened was that spiritualism took off, and the idea became that these groups that would get together would start to see the afterlife. And a lot of the people like the Poughkeepsie Seer and the Fox sisters, all these people who are on this amazing kind of spiritualist psychic trip, like Emma Britton from the Orphic Circle, they were coming into a world where, they were coming back and saying, hey, the spiritual world is just like this one. It's a continuation of this life, which apparently is something, according to Steiner, that the mystery schools did not want them to have any inkling toward. They didn't like this idea. They were getting the wrong impression. Basically, the experiment had gone wrong. And so there was sort of a battle of the mystery schools, and the truce figure, the one that everyone decided, okay, we'll allow her to bring forward some of these truths, was Helena Blavatsky, who had been from Russia. And if you're familiar with the X series, you know her background very well. She was the founding member of Theosophy, but she had been to mystery schools in Tibet and mystery schools in Egypt. And her whole life really seems designed that she was going to do this. As a matter of fact, one of the things that Steiner points out in relation to her is that she was foretold, so that the mystery schools knew by astrological alignments that she was coming. This is how deep some of the things go on the mystery school side. So we have a picture there of this kind of topsy-turvy thing that was going on in this period. And the X Steganography started to rise through groups like Theosophy, where it was embodied right in the logo. By the time we get to Steiner's work, he is giving us a message that the primary school in the Western tradition on the mystery side are the Rosicrucians. And we're going to get into the Rosicrucians because it relates to the time capsule work and to the Georgia Guidestones work. As we remember, for people familiar with the Georgia Guidestones, it's R.C. Christian who comes forward and makes this. So it's quite a dynamic picture that starts to formulate together when we look at this. That is the mystery school side. Now, I promised you I was going to bring together the mystery school side with the kind of modern political side and the setups there. So before we go into the 21st century aspect, let's go back into the 20th century and find a character of President Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon had many unusual bedfellows and very interesting contacts when we really look at his past, which are thoroughly verifiable. One of them, which I think was the most interesting, Olivia, is that a picture of Jeane Dixon over there on that? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd actually like that one. Thank you. Talk about timing. There we go. It's Jeane Dixon. And if you're familiar with the X series, we talk a lot about Jeane Dixon because an interesting thing happened, which is right around the time of 9/11, they started to do this researching into these kind of plans for dealing with terrorists and all the rest. And they were going through in that period, about 2003, right after 9/11, and they were going through the original responses that previous presidential administrations had had to terror, and they realized that Nixon had put together this coalition of advisors for dealing with terrorism, because they were having things like bombings and kidnappings and, you know, the PLO and all this kind of thing. And they found 81 visits, and this is reported even in mainstream media. Newsweek carried this story. 81 visits or phone calls from this very interesting woman. And what's interesting also about Jean is that she was very close with a number of politicians, not just Nixon, of course. I think my camera's gone awry here. Let's take a.
Uh-oh.
It has a little bit. There's some wild fuzz here. This is a new camera, and just hang in there, everybody. I'm sure we're going to get it back.
It may be a little defective. Hopefully it isn't.
It's so hyper dynamic. Let's try this out. Hang tough for a second. Woo. Yes, we're getting. I think it is still a little fuzzy. It's coming through pretty fuzzy. Well, we're gonna ride it out a little bit. I may actually just end up taking it off, but we'll see how we do here. I'm gonna remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalists, and Miss Olivia, how are your questions going?
Questions are coming in very casually.
Casual,
casually is good. Yeah, they're not all needy and desperate tonight. So everybody just wants to listen to you present.
This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to have you unplug the camera, and we're just going to use the camera right off of the machine.
So what do you mean unplug it?
Actually, just unplug it, literally.
Okay.
This one. Hang in there, everyone.
Just like this,
yes.
right?
Okay. Okay.
All right. Better?
Let's see here. Okay, everyone, hang in there. We're having small technical difficulties. In the meantime, while I get that cleared up, Miss Olivia, why don't you read a few things that you're seeing out there?
Okay. Well, Koldasi had a really interesting question. Why has the Steiner schools, why have they not been subject to government interference, considering that they are trying to create good students and not a slave market?
Well, here we go. We're back. That's a little bit better. Let's try this out. Yes. Okay. We're back. I think everyone can confirm you can see it now, right? Yes. Okay. That's a little bit better. We had the hyper camera tonight, but I think we're back. Okay. So let's try the question again. So basically, why are the Steiner schools...
Why haven't they been attacked, since they are creating good students and not a slave race?
Well, the Waldorf schools, which Rudolf Steiner created, are they're very limited. That is, I mean, in terms of childhood education, they have a tremendous impact. And in America, they certainly are a breakthrough, very much like some of the other, like Montessori schools, for example. But in terms of making that kind of huge national impact, of course, you make an impact when you're dealing even with one student. But in terms of that gigantic impact that you would get, you know, really rippling through society and getting people turned off of the kind of rap culture and things like that, and the junk culture that Hollywood puts out, then they probably would be more of a threat and more under attack. But as it is, they're seen largely, I think, by those types of forces as mostly boutique in their approach and in their effect that they have on society. And that's a good question, though. Waldorf schools, I mean, when we think about Steiner, I want to talk about just how heavy a figure that he is, because, you know, when he creates biodynamic farming, when he creates eurythmy, when he creates the Waldorf schools, when he creates spiritual science, this is somebody who is not only prolific, but he's also someone who has incredible academic integrity. And that's very rare. You know, if you think about someone like Blavatsky, for example, she's an incredible mystic. But in terms of, you know, her academic credentials, or in terms of, you know, her ability to really formulate her thoughts in a fashion after a Western intellectual tradition that other people could walk into. I mean, we didn't really have that. Steiner is kind of one of the main scholars that brings forward the esoteric truths, which is why I think anthroposophy and spiritual science are something that we're discovering so much now, because so much of his work is being translated. And this is interesting too. I want to point this out, which the majority of Steiner's work we're only starting to get to, because a lot of those translations come after 1990. So we're talking about 25 years of time. So, you know, before that, even though he died in 1925, and the majority of his work is between, say, 1900 and 1925, a lot of that got translated. You know, like it finally got into circulation after 1990. There were some standout books before that, for sure. People understood, like, knowledge of higher worlds and things like that. But all of these lectures and all these different things really came along a lot later. And I want to emphasize Steiner, as I do in this series, because Steiner is a figure, I think, through whom we can see the direct interaction with the public of the mystery schools through someone. And that makes him unique in that sense. And he's somebody who seemed to understand that he was being used that way. And that kind of interaction with the mystery schools, I think, is absolutely crucial. We're going to be taking more questions too, but those were good questions while we were getting our camera action together. And that the fancy camera is definitely it's going back.
There was a comment about what was wrong with the old camera. The old camera died.
Yeah, it's weird. I've had this weird succession of cameras that do this like weird flickering and then freak out. I guess I'm just running high voltage. I don't know. High voltage aura. Let's do that. Okay, so we're back to Gene Dixon. So here we have President Richard Nixon calling in Gene Dixon as one of his crucial aides. And she's giving him advice like where people are going to be taken hostage and what we should do with the Middle East and how we should deal with the Russians. I mean, very intense advice. And Nixon is somebody who was privy throughout his career to very deep information of being vice president under Eisenhower. And a number of things have come out in relation to Nixon about how he ran something called CIA Project Blue Book, which was, you know, different from the sham one that the public got. But this is the one dealing with the UFO file, coming in there and setting up Area 51, getting information from crash retrievals, tracking these craft, you know, and developing these craft also. We should put that in there. This is all something that comes under the purview through a variety of whistleblowers. We get this information about Nixon running this program. And he seemed to have a great deal of knowledge in relation to it. If you've watched the program enough, you will get the impression that Nixon is one of the main insiders when it comes to the UFO file, which may have been one of the kind of big problems that we had going on with Nixon, and why he gets ousted and rather unceremoniously for doing the types of things that really, let's face it, every other president had done before him. So there are great things to discover there when we look at Nixon. What I want to point out is that last February, I put together a program with a whistleblower named Robert Merritt. And I have some pictures of Merritt, actually. But one of the things that he did for me is he cleared up this notion, this kind of combination of Nixon and Trump. And what Merritt did, which I think is significant, is he's well known, if you look at these Watergate books, he's well known as somebody that they associated with the Nixon administration, having done different types of intelligence work. And he's always around this Watergate milieu. And you can find these books from the 80s and 90s that cite Robert Merritt. He's a very interesting character, and I spent many hours in conversation with him, thoroughly convinced of his validity and credentials through my conversations and with others. But one of the things that Merritt told me was that President Nixon had kept a time capsule when it seemed like Watergate was going to take him out. Now, he had a little background on Nixon. He had developed something called the Huston Plan, which is still one of the most unusual intelligence programs. that was ever developed because it was run directly out of the White House as an intelligence unit. Now, they had something like this called the Plumbers later, and those are the guys who got into trouble breaking into Watergate. But the Huston Plan was more, the way that Merritt tells it, they had looked at very kind of dubious tasks, like, bombing foundations and things like that. And so he was one of the main undercover agents in the Huston Plan. Now, the Huston Plan is no myth. In the Church Committee, it came out that there were all these things about the Huston Plan that were very disturbing, and that they felt that it was one of the most unusual things any president had ever done developing it, and that their work was all classified. And so it was impossible to really get a read on it. And they were trying desperately to declassify those documents, and most of them remained classified. Now, Merritt was the agent operating inside of the Huston Plans, one of the main guys. And what he said about his meetings in the White House is chilling. I have an episode up there called Nixon's Time Capsule with Robert Merritt, and I highly recommend that for viewing. So we put that up last February 14th, and that information became available. And inside of that episode, Robert Merritt tells us that there is a time capsule that Nixon placed in the White House that related to this X technology. And it related to the possibility of energy independence for America, which is something that Nixon was apparently working toward. And I detailed that he was working on that research in a facility called Pine Gap, which is why there was a major explosion of activity around Pine Gap in this period right after Nixon gets ousted, and we'll get into that. But the point is that Merritt went forward and said, Nixon placed this time capsule inside the White House because he wanted to be known as the disclosure president around this at some point. Now, in my own X research, I've found a number of letters and things relating to this. And I want to show you a couple now. And if people are familiar with the X series will certainly get the idea. But for example, this is the X envelope at the LBJ White House. And there's a series of these from different presidents. This one is to be opened in 2023. The contents of the envelope are eyes only, and it's to be instructed 50 years after his death, open it. So in 2023, we get to see what's inside there. Interestingly enough, Eisenhower himself kept a time capsule, and this is something called Project X. And I have a passage from it that I'm going to read a little bit later. Well, actually, I have it here. Let's read this one now. Now, this is very interesting from a biography of Nixon and Eisenhower, and we're going to cite more from this. It's all about the book is called The Apprentice. And I'm just going to jump to this quote here. Sometime that spring or summer, 1953, the President, Eisenhower, made a handwritten list for Project X, the time capsule located at his Gettysburg farm. Item number 1 was Nixon. So Eisenhower put together a time capsule in 1953 to be opened in 100 years in 2053. And the first item in it is Nixon. What I derived from that was that Nixon had something significant, and it was related to this X. Now, Eisenhower's X letter, X time capsule at his Gettysburg farm, LBJ's letter at the LBJ library, letter X. Over and over again, the X Steganography, as we've tracked it through this program, through the work of Walter Dornberger, through the work of the X-15, always the projects go black and then turn up with this X. But the X letters, time capsules. So I've called them stealth archives because they're just out of reach. We know that they're there, but we can't open them and read them. Now, again, with Merritt's story, this plays right into the same theme. Merritt said, Well, the time capsule related to something called X, Planet X. They called it Planet X. So here's the X Steganography again in the heart of Merritt's story. Now, Merritt's story is very fascinating. In a couple of rich details I'm going to lay out here is that inside of the time capsule letter is an energy formula that they had got from working with the UFO file, which would transform the entire energy scene. And that Nixon was planning on releasing, as I said, in 1975. When his presidency was under siege, what he did was he read aloud this letter to Merritt in the White House, in the basement of the White House. And he strapped a copy of the letter onto Merritt's chest and instructed him to go to Henry Kissinger and give it to him. So in this sense, this Huston Plan operative, Robert Merritt, was a messenger going to deliver this very powerful copy. And there was some kind of interesting relationship there with Merritt and Nixon, where Merritt said that for some reason Nixon trusted him. And when he read him the whole letter, Merritt's somebody who really didn't have a great interest in aliens and still doesn't. He didn't have a great interest in this whole aspect of things, but he had gone through this experience and he related it to me. And I will say that as a whistleblower goes, you know, I spoke to him for hours and I asked him that same story 8 or 9 different ways. And as a journalist, I can tell you when somebody just keeps to the facts. And over again, Merritt's story was entirely consistent, which is hard to do if you're one of those whistleblowers. So Merritt certainly made an impression on me. One of the things that he told me in relation to this is, as I said, that Nixon placed a time capsule in the White House and that he did expect that it would be found, but it would take a long time, but it would come out when the time was right. As far as he knew, the only 2 people who knew about it, in addition to Nixon, were himself and Kissinger. But he always felt that there could be somebody else. So we did this story, and I said, do you know where it is? And he indeed did know where it was. So this was all very, very interesting to me. So last February, we put out this episode, and oddly enough, right off the bat, Snopes came out and jumped on this, which I thought was interesting because, you know, here we do our work and we put out a number of different things. But Snopes was really all over this one. They were like, can't be true, can't be true. You know, yes, Merritt is who he says he is, but there's no way, you know. But they did leave it in that category. They didn't say it was a false story. They said it was unknown, which I thought was interesting. But just the attention on it itself struck me as unusual. And then it popped up in a few other mainstream venues. And I started to think to myself, you know, we kind of rubbed something. Merritt's story, you know, given as he's in these stages of a terminal illness, you know, this is really, it's a long deathbed confession, basically. And it's a piece of history that we just didn't have. And it related directly to Nixon having this ability. In terms of the veracity of the information, all I can say is it does not look to me like there are any external motives for Merritt to bring the story forward. So let's examine the implications of the story. Nixon works in CIA Blue Book on the UFO file. Nixon, over that process of time, develops, working with the UFO file, an entirely different type of energy that is usable to solve all of America's energy independence problems and transform the world. As a result of this, Nixon is planning to, with the facility help of Pine Gap, redevelop this energy and start to distribute it. Now, I have articles here that will show, without a doubt, that Nixon had work going on at Pine Gap on an alternative energy source. They're articles grabbed from headlines in Australia. And I'll remind everyone, as I dig around for all this wildness, that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the first time we've ever run 3 shows in a row. So we're on part 2 of the marathon going on here. Last night we had the secret space program controversy. Tonight we're doing the time capsule with the Georgia Guidestones and President Nixon. And tomorrow night we have Dr. Joseph Farrell and we're going to go deep with him on his new book about mind control. We're going to go deep on the Templars and some new information that's coming out about Antarctica. And I have an episode, one of our top episodes is an episode I did with Dr. Farrell on Antarctica. So Joseph, if you're out there, we're really looking forward to that tomorrow night.
And I think we can also ask Joseph about the fires in California.
Isn't that interesting?
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a great point. Certainly something there, and I know that Joseph has written extensively about that kind of technology. And that's at 6 p.m. tomorrow night, everyone. I hope you're going to be joining us. But back to a few things here. I want to do a little show and tell to get us all on the same page. This is the book by Erwin Gelman that references the Eisenhower Time Capsule, The President and the Apprentice, about that interesting relationship between Eisenhower and Nixon, who he had to trust, but he didn't trust. One of those catch-22 situations. I'm going to take a quick look at some things that I've cited in the program a lot, but I haven't really cited them much lately, but we're going to need them for context tonight. This one's about Frank Scully, and Frank Scully was a very interesting writer in the early 50s who tripped into a story about a crash in Aztec, New Mexico that involved a number of government officials getting involved with very quickly and trying to suss out what it was that had crashed. Post-Roswell, and this relates directly to the UFO file, the FBI went to a lot of trouble to try to discredit this guy. But, he had a lot of connections. He had been in this milieu of writers and society and Los Angeles and all this stuff, and it was hard to get rid of him. And, of course, the X-Files Scully gets her name from this character. I want to bring him up because this hounding by the FBI is very interesting because they had developed this set of X-Files relating to the UFO file, and the man in charge of it was someone named Guy Bannister. And Bannister shows up in all these newspaper articles shopping around looking for these saucers in all these northwestern states like Oregon and Washington. And that was his beat, basically. And interestingly enough, one of the guys who's working around him at that period is Jim Garrison. And Jim Garrison and Guy Bannister are both going to turn up under very unusual circumstances back there in New Orleans with Garrison prosecuting Clay Shaw for the JFK assassination, and Bannister turning up as one of the interesting characters in all of this, coaching Lee Harvey Oswald to become the patsy. So whenever you get around this UFO stuff in that period, you're always going to run into the clash of the JFK with the deep state and them removing him because they had other plans for the technology that they were developing. So I hope all that is clear. I've showed this one, which is the X envelope. That's LBJ's. It's eyes only. It is there. Verified it myself that it's at the LBJ library to be opened in 2023. Somebody got an itchy finger on it, and in 1994, after this is interesting. After Nixon died, for some reason, a lot of attention came on this envelope because they thought this was going to relate to some story between LBJ and Nixon. And when they pulled out a page of it or whatever, it had them tracking Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, who was in, of all places, New Mexico, not too far from where most of these secret bases are. So there's something very strange about this, but we won't see it until 2023. And even then, we have to wonder if they'll just say, oh, that's classified, and that's the end of that. When I cited the X Steganography earlier, I wanted to show, and I won't spend too much time on this, but the fact that it harkens back to ancient times, the fact that it harkens back to traditions like the Book of the Dead and this whole thing, and then we see it popping up through government programs. I want to keep that in our heads in terms of how we see mystery schools working through this period, and then later you see political forces adopting ways and means and methods and symbols that they're using. That gives us a hint that these are two parts of the same story. This is directly from that Book of the Dead imagery, and we have the X Steganography, and basically what's going on here, as far as I can tell, is that they're keeping this information whatever vital information that related to this high technology that brought the former culture down, these guys hold it. This is a kind of a holding place so it doesn't get out and cause that kind of mayhem again. And this is the way I read a lot of the steganography that comes out of that period. So just to kind of give you a handle on that. Okay. So the X Steganography takes on a larger-than-life possibility, I'd say, when we come to the 21st century. This is the cover of Wired magazine, and it's fascinating because there are so many examples of this. I only use subtle ones here and there, but it's just endless. The technology and its involvement with space and hidden space technology and capabilities always turns up. Here's Bezos here talking about space and how he's going to go into space, and he is standing in front of a gigantic X. Of course, Elon Musk's company is named SpaceX, and his main company was called X, which he turned into PayPal. So there's always this kind of X imagery, the X Steganography, whenever we get into space. So, it takes on a particularly interesting messaging back and forth when we get around this particular topic. And I want to kind of update us on that as we go. Now, let's take a look at a few people. This is something that when I first started telling people about it, they didn't believe it was the real thing, which was fascinating, and I can appreciate it. But I verified it because the actual person who was there and took it was a New York Times reporter, and so I was able to track it through AP. This is a picture of now current President Trump here with his then wife, Ivana. And this is over here President Nixon, who became close friends with future President Trump. And I have the letters between them that I've shown here that are in the National Archives. And in the middle is John Connolly, who was in the death car when Kennedy was assassinated. The reason this is important is because the way we have to understand politics, especially seasoned politicians like Nixon, is photos are important and photo opportunities are important, and you just don't let yourself be seen in any old place. You're always messaging when you're a politician. Here, there's a clear message being sent, which is whatever forces there were that took Nixon out of office, in my opinion, were related to his work around this developing an alternative energy source. And the fact that he becomes close with Trump is very interesting, because what I've demonstrated on this program is that Trump's uncle, John Trump, had worked at MIT and was an engineer and a professor, and he was the protege of Vannevar Bush. And Vannevar Bush, as we know, was in charge of the UFO file. And I think that's pretty well demonstrated in the episodes we've done here. So what this means is that in this picture, we have future President Trump and Nixon. Trump's uncle had this knowledge about the UFO file. Nixon was developing an alternative energy source related to it. In the middle is John Connolly, who actually was wounded during the Kennedy assassination. Kennedy, of course, was in the very center of the battle, and I've brought forward memos that have been declassified showing him saying we need to release X amount of UFO info, and I want to share the UFO info with the Soviets. Now, to bring a lot of this circle around, Robert Merritt, who we were talking about in relation to the Huston Plan, talking to me about the time capsule, goes on the record basically saying that this is what Nixon was doing, and that he got a copy to Henry Kissinger. But there's a relationship here which also relates to Douglas Caddy, who's the former Watergate lawyer, who's been on this program talking to us about how his close friend, E. Howard Hunt, had said to him before he went to prison for the Watergate crimes that the reason for the Kennedy assassination was because Kennedy was going to reveal the information about the UFO file, which was our biggest national security secret. Now, these facts are all on the record now. This isn't something to dispute. That's Caddy's account of his discussion with his friend. My conversation with Merritt is Merritt's account of what happened when he was there with President Nixon. Merritt's background is indisputable in that the Nixon administration used him as an operative. So we've got quite a tapestry of information, as you can see here. And the only way that I can really make any sense of it is when I swing wildly back and forth between the 19th and the 21st century. So this is where we've arrived at this very key point. Now, a lot of things are going to open up when we get into the Georgia Guidestone aspect, which we'll be getting into in a few minutes. But I'm going to ask Miss Olivia right now how we're doing out there.
Doing great. You want a question?
Yeah, I'm going to remind everyone that you're watching the Dark Journalist show. And this is a very special show relating to the disclosure time capsules that are held at these various places that I call, they're basically stealth archives, that we know that they're there, and it's an open secret, but we can't get our hands on them for one reason or another. This is quite a tie-in that we're going to draw with the Georgia Guidestones later in the program, and then we're also going to take your questions. And I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com to sign up for the newsletter with the incredible, and I mean remarkable, smackdown that we're seeing relating to all of this on social media. You know, I guess the groups, it's such a targeted campaign over the last 6 months, the purges that have been going on, whether it's with libertarian groups or conservative voices, or even someone like Alex Jones. They just want to get him out of there. And a lot of this was election related, but we still see that activity going on. The best way to avoid it, sign up for the newsletter, and that gives us a direct channel back and forth where we're really kind of, we're in a different kind of situation that way. We have a direct communication line as opposed to them one day waking up and shutting down the Dark Journalist entire channel.
Mm-hmm.
Knock, knock on wood, that won't happen, but we know how these things roll. So yes, please do lay a question on me.
Okay, Michael Now. Does DJ think that Roger Stone represents a direct link from Nixon's X letter and Trump? And Nick Nelson wants to know, is Roger Stone Q?
Wow, those are great questions. I'll put it to you this way. Roger Stone's a very important figure. Roger Stone has been there. He started with the Young Republicans for Nixon, and he was there very young, I think like 20 years old. And he got those meetings directly with Nixon, and he was somebody that Nixon used. Stone worked for Reagan. He was part of Manafort and Stone, Black and Stone, and we know Manafort's in prison now. So he's such a deep operator. He was the person responsible for Governor Elliot Spitzer going down in New York. So he's known as a kind of a Republican hatchet man. I mean, that's basically his gig. And he's been on this program, actually. I've interviewed Roger because he was doing some good work on LBJ.
Yeah, you didn't actually like Roger, if I remember.
No, I wouldn't say that. My way of looking at Roger is there are always guys out there like that who are going to be on the kind of...
He's a controversial figure. He's
a controversial guy, but, Republican and Democrats, like, they need those tricksters in a way to go out there and whip things up. But I will say we got a lot of information from Stone, and whether or not I think Stone was Q, because of course Q has changed hands so many times now. It's a totally different thing than it was when it started. And I think the people who have it now are just amateurs. But groups like somebody like Stone could have been behind that. It was almost like, if you think about the work that they did, some of Q could be looked at almost as like a political PAC in some way on the Trump side. So yeah, he's definitely a good candidate for that. Whether or not he was the liaison between Trump and Nixon is interesting. He certainly worked very close with both of them, so he'd be aware of some of the deeper aspects that were going on between the two. I mentioned earlier, and I never tire of showing this letter. This is a letter from President Nixon to future President Trump, and it really encourages him and predicts, thinking of Gene Dixon again, it predicts he's going to become president. You will be a winner, it says at the end. This is from December 21st, 1987, and it's Dear Donald. And of course, Nixon would move to New York, and they would be seen at these events. Nixon, in my opinion, based on the research I've done, was an incredible tutor for Trump and his future presidential aspirations, and highly encouraged Trump during the election of 1988, where we had Dukakis versus Bush, to go out and make speeches, go to Iowa and make speeches. Even if you don't run, get out there so people can see you on this. So Nixon had a direct hand there. And I think his presence with John Connally and Trump at that photo op tells us a lot that we need to know when we think about time capsules and we think about legacies of things and we think about the visuals. Of course, a few minutes before Kennedy is assassinated, this is John Connally there driving with him. And when we take Douglas Caddy's testimony, the Watergate lawyer, saying that the CIA spy chief, E. Howard Hunt, had told him that Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file, the whole picture starts to formulate a little bit better, I think, for us. And we get a much better handle on it than the type of history that we've been given about crazed nuts or lone gunmen and all that kind of stuff. We know that that's junk. So when we get out of that, what do we have in the alternative research field? There's a body of information, but how do we make any sense of it? Well, interestingly enough, the X Steganography, for me, and the work that we've brought forward has allowed me to go deeper and open these things up and see those connections. And especially when you get to Nixon, the X Time Capsule. Of course, we're going to do more on this here. Yes.
David Tormina wants to know, was it Stone's presence on InfoWars that got Alex Jones deplatformed?
I wouldn't be surprised. Well, it's kind of fascinating because they had really created something on the Alex Jones show that became a platform for Trump. Now, the entire 93% of the alternative media field supported Trump. But the alternative media field didn't grow up until 2016, until that election. And then the incredible power of that was brought forward because people were so sick and tired of the status quo. And they kind of embodied Trump with a number of features, saying like, he's going to clean up the swamp. He's going to do all these things. Now, there's no question that Trump has been a shock to the system. And whatever system was in place, he has certainly shaken it up. But I think a lot of the projection on Trump as a figure that's a kind of savior figure comes out of that kind of Stone milieu, that kind of Alex Jones, the Q thing. And they put Trump in this position. And I understand it from a support level, but I do feel that when you get like Twitter involved, you get YouTube involved, and you get Facebook involved, booting out Alex Jones, that's basically a Democratic operation throwing out Republican operators. There's no doubt about it in my mind, because certainly any kind of libertarian strands that Alex Jones had by the time he was thrown off of the social media platforms were largely gone. I mean, he had gone full on Republican. Yes.
Okay, mods or monsters. DJ, does Roger Stone use white magic or black magic?
What do you think? It's not the kind of guy I'd expect to turn up in church. I'll put it to you that way. I mentioned John Trump, and I can't go by without showing his picture. This is Trump's uncle. You might see pictures of Trump's uncle out there that are photoshopped to make him look like Julian Assange. Don't fall for that. This is the real guy. He does not look particularly like Julian Assange. And he lived, we're in Cambridge here, and he lived over in Watertown, which is about 10 minutes from here. And he worked at MIT, of course. And one day, Olivia and I went over to MIT, and we went to get the Trump files, actually, the John Trump files for all of his work that he was doing on radar and X-ray and all the rest of it. And they said, well, yeah, there's a 24-hour waiting period, though. Are you cool with that? And it was all very interesting. And then when we finally got to it, the box itself was called Box X. So the steganography around this was remarkable and way, 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 way beyond coincidence. And not that there was anything too spectacular in the archives at MIT for John Trump. I'm sure anything significant had been purged already. But nonetheless, the tagging system, that symbol recognizer, that router X was there nonetheless. Now, we've shown on this program that Vannevar Bush was the direct, he was the mentor for Trump, for John Trump. John Trump having that access to the UFO file changes, I think, everything that we have to consider when it comes to these things about time capsules, when it comes to the considerations about things like the Space Force. We have to look at Trump as a much more informed figure than we did before, as this kind of braggart real estate developer who had ideas for shaking up things like immigration. We have to look at him more as a progressive figure on the technological side who is developing the space politic. This is an important difference, I think, from how the mainstream media is portraying this as predominantly, how would we say this? This guy who's really interested in nationalism and really, he's a controversial figure on race and all this kind of stuff. Let's think of him very differently. Let's think of him as the architect of space politics. And I think we get a lot closer to the truth. Okay. Since Robert Merritt mentioned to me the thing about Planet X in there, interestingly enough, in this article that was put out by NASA, they were talking all about Planet X and if they had discovered it. Now, they have this thing called Planet 9 because, of course, they've got rid of Pluto as a planet, which is absurd, but hey, they're doing it anyway. And they're embracing this idea of Planet X, which is something that had been theorized all the way back to the 18th century. So there is a body out there in our system now that we can categorically say exists. They just don't know the full extent of it. But they're willing to call it Planet X now. That's a little more open. And we've heard all kinds of wildness about Planet X and Nibiru and all this kind of thing through the years, through people like Sitchin and all the rest of it. And, everybody got really Sitchined out and, they just blasted that stuff 24 hours a day, it seemed like. But I do feel that Planet X plays into this, and the naming system also. I don't think that's by accident, just like I don't think the X letters are by accident. I think these things form a pattern, and I think they're in the heart of the X Steganography. And that's why the time capsules are called X. And that's why the story that Merritt gives us relating to Nixon and his time capsule is particularly significant, and why LBJ's and Eisenhower's time capsules getting opened in 2023 and 2053, we're going to get a lot of those answers, apparently. So I think that's a whole different level now that we've arrived in our research. Now we're going to look at a very unusual connection between some of that 19th century mystery school stuff that I mentioned and the 20th, 21st century political dynamics. Now we're going to go right into the heart of the Georgia Guidestones and how they relate to this. Now I'm going to say right off the bat, there are so many good experts on the Georgia Guidestones who can really lead you through the minutia on them. For me, I was looking for one particular thing. How does the time capsule X Steganography story relate to this very unusual story of the Georgia Guidestones? And in looking at that, I definitely got my answer. So I'm going to roll into those now. And while I do that, Miss Olivia, how are we doing over there?
We're doing great. Somebody mentioned something great here. Do you know that Phil Corso went to visit Jane Dixon on her deathbed?
Well, that's very interesting to me because, of course, I knew they were close friends. I didn't hear about the deathbed story, but wow, that is fascinating.
What did you know about their friendship?
Well, what's interesting is Corso and Gene Dixon were both close friends with Strom Thurmond. Remember the first copy of his book, Corso's book, which was all about the day after Roswell and how he handled all those materials and all the rest of it under the Foreign Technology Office, was all about, that introduction was written by Strom Thurmond, who was a very unusual figure. He had run for president himself, but he was the longest running senator, I think, besides Jay Rockefeller, in the Senate, and or Robert Byrd. And he wrote this great intro saying, hey, Corso's this amazing guy. I believe everything he says. He's served on my staff. He was close to General Trudeau. He's awesome. And then the minute they found out it was about UFOs, the whole thing went through the roof. And they were freaking out. They were like, we're going to sue you, Corso. Like, get that intro out of there. But the first 1,000 copies of that book have that intro in there. Corso was very close friends with Dixon and Strom Thurmond, and Strom Thurmond, there's always all these pictures and everything about Strom Thurmond and Dixon. Something very, very unusual there in those political dynamics. Okay, somewhere on March 22nd, in Georgia, 1980. A very unusual structure was unveiled that had been in development only a little over a year. That is the Georgia Guidestones, which a lot of people say is America's Stonehenge. And it's quite interesting because the way that it's developed does incorporate a lot of ancient builder principles. And the fingerprints of mystery school interference, a mystery school coming out and really moving this mainstream is absolutely where the story is going to go. Okay, as we look at this, this is the structure itself. And it does have a lot of what you'd expect in the Stonehenge type fashion, except it's a modern development. Let's take a look at a few unusual things about the structure before we figure out how it was made and all the rest of it. First of all, on the structure are these 10 commandments. 10 commandments, keep that in mind too. Number 1, the most controversial, maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. Everyone sees that as a call to exterminate the rest of the population, which at the time this was developed was around 4 billion. I think that's a mistake, and I think it's a mistake also in how they put this out there. And I think that this relates to a 19th century doctrine that came directly out of this mystery school activity, and that's why the figure is 500 million and seems so out of date by the time it actually is rolled out. And I'm going to explain why that's true. 2, guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness with diversity. Okay, all of these seem pretty practical. Unite humanity with a living new language. Interesting. Rule passion, faith, tradition, and all things with tempered reason. Protect people and nations with fair laws and just courts. 6, let all nations rule internally, resolving external disputes in a world court. The kind of idealism that launched the League of Nations. Avoid petty laws and useless officials. 8, balance personal rights with social duties. 9, prize truth, beauty, love, seeking harmony with the infinite. Okay. 10, be not a cancer on the earth, leave room for nature. Leave room for nature. Twice.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Here's some other interesting things that are carved on the stone. So take a look at these. And this says, astronomic features channeled through the stone indicate celestial pole. There is the North Star. This Polaris light comes directly through one of the points in the building. So they're incorporating well-known, hardcore Egyptian builder type tradition. You know, that's something that you could find at Stonehenge, something you would find in the pyramids, that kind of thing. They are hearkening back to that older culture there. Arthur R.C. Christian, a pseudonym, misspelled. It says N at the end instead of M. It's interesting. Sponsors, a small group of Americans who seek the Age of Reason. The Age of Reason is a very important book by Thomas Paine. But they're seeking the Age of Reasons, and they're definitely identified as American. R.C. Christian, of course, the Rosicrucians, the Rosy Cross Christian. That's the way they are identified. The Rosicrucians, identified by Rudolf Steiner in Anthroposophy as the most active, the most powerful mystery school in the Western tradition. But the very bottom of this, considering the work that we're doing, is quite fascinating. What does it say here? It says, time capsule, placed 6 feet below this spot, to be opened on blank. Time capsule, again. And that's on the Georgia Guidestones. Time capsule's never been opened. To be opened on blank. Placed 6 feet below this spot. Well, everyone knows. Of course, there are cameras at Georgia Guidestones, but if it's 6 feet below the spot, somebody could just roll in there, dig it up, and take it. It's obviously not there, but it's very interesting, this reference to this time capsule at the Georgia Guidestones. Certainly some kind of time capsule is there, but saying 6 feet below the spot. To be opened on blank, intentionally left blank. this is very much like the X Time Capsule letters. It's almost the exact same thing, except there's no date here. I've thought about this as kind of the missing time capsule when we think about Nixon's being in the White House. What time capsule are they referring to? And why would they even have a time capsule? This is the type of thing that got me going in this direction. I'm going to show more, but Miss Olivia, you had something.
It's very strange because it's not well known that there's a time capsule there. Nobody ever talks about that.
I'll tell you, in all the research that I've done, nobody ever mentioned that there was a time capsule. It is quite unusual. This is the stone that holds those 10 commandments. And again, they're hearkening back to that old builder tradition, giving us some idea that there's an esoteric root to the reason that it exists, period. Okay. This is actually a very interesting graphic developed by Wired magazine of all people, but it shows that the instructions are put in a number of different languages. One of the languages that it's put in, I mean, you can imagine it should be put in different types of languages, but Egyptian hieroglyphs and Babylonian cuneiform, that's a little bit interesting. Classical Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic. Okay, so really, when you're looking at these, you're thinking, hieroglyphs, the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian mystery tradition, the Kabbalah with Hebrew, Babylonians. They're giving us that hint that this is that powerful combination of information. Because if it was just like, we want you to read this now and read it in a number of different languages, then you have Russian, Chinese, and all the rest of it, which they have Russian and Spanish. Why hieroglyphs? Hieroglyphs is a language that went out over 2,000 years ago. So there's significant clues about it. Okay, now I'm going to draw the Georgia Guidestones directly into the X Steganography because of the way that they are created. The overhead view of the Georgia Guidestones is a clear X, and they are hearkening directly to this X Steganography, and now the X Steganography time capsule, which we see over and over again related to these people. What are they trying to tell us with the X Steganography around these ancient monuments in relation to time capsules? Here is that statement a little bit crisper, and over here it says time capsule, placed 6 feet below the spot to be opened on. That's there at the bottom, just to give you that little piece. So you can see that we're in pretty deep now. We've gone deep. This is another overhead shot to kind of get a little of that X picture. So it's set up as an X. It's actually set in this situation. One more shot from a slightly different angle. Georgia Guidestones, they incorporate aspects of Baalbek, they incorporate aspects of Egyptian builder technique, and they incorporate aspects of Stonehenge. This is a very complete development in terms of sending a message when you know that you're talking to other builders who can read the thing that you're putting out there. More from the Guidestones, and it says, let these Guidestones to an age of reason. Let these be Guidestones to an age of reason, rather. And above it, we see Babylonian cuneiform, Classical Greek, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Sanskrit. Let's take another look at that. Sanskrit, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Babylonian cuneiform, Greek classical. Well, I've talked on this program about how the Rosetta Stone opened up our understanding, and so that all those hieroglyphics only 200 years ago stopped being pretty pictures, and we understood that they were histories that detailed all kinds of events and all kinds of activities related to the ancient Egyptians. Before the steganography of the hieroglyphics was really opened up, before that came forward in the Rosetta Stone, we didn't understand anything about it. There were hints and all the rest of it, but they just didn't know. But because there was the same announcement in 3 different languages, we got a piece of it. We understood how to decipher it. It opened up the whole thing. It was the key. The X Steganography works as the same kind of key as the Rosetta Stone does, if you know what you're looking for. What I would hope to do and what I would hope to find in looking at the Georgia Guidestones is that crisscross correlation with the mystery schools. And the link that I think we're finding is the builder tradition. Now, interestingly enough, somewhere along the line, somebody decided to get cute, and they put a block onto the stones that had been there many years. And they put this block on it in 2014. And it's mostly regarded as just somebody going there and doing that. You know, it's not really regarded as part of the original thing. And they took it out eventually. Let's take a look at what it said. 20. Now there's more numbers related to what's on that Georgia Guidestone. But I want to focus on the 20. The 20 is interesting because, again, we have this whole thing about 322. And 322 is the number when they launched it. But 322 also relates to something very interesting, a strange coincidence that we started the whole program off with, relating to Steiner and Goethe. Now, we know 322 comes up certainly in relation to these different groups and some of the secret societies. Skull and Bones, the skull and crossbones with the X is 322. And, you know, it's inescapable that launching it on that date, 322, that there's some kind of crisscrossing significance. So I looked for a number of different reasons why they would have used that. And what came across, what occurred to me was that it had to have some kind of Rosicrucian root. And I went back to Steiner's work because Steiner has said that the anthroposophical tradition basically came out of Rosicrucian tradition, and Christian Rosenkreutz brought the Western tradition back. So what I'm going to show you as we get in here is that there's the 322 clearly relates to Steiner and Goethe and the Rosicrucian tradition, and that's why it's there, which is going to give us some strange connection between Steiner's work and the Georgia Guidestones. And I'm going to show it in such a way that I think, for me, it's very convincing, and let's see how you feel about it. So the fate of the, well, let's call it the phony cube, but we're going to say why somebody put a cube there. Let's take a look at what happened to the cube after a while. It was removed. They just hired workmen and said, get that out of there. Crowd looked on, and these guys went up there and took it out. It's gone. When they took it out, everybody got a good look at it, and it had other numbers on it. There's been vandalism around it before, but this is the first time somebody tried to implant something on there. And I do think it's significant. And I don't think that we fully understand what it was, but it gives us an idea that something is happening in relation to the timing around these things. That was my first guess with it. And as I pull up the next one, Miss Olivia,
two questions. Okay, so they're asking whether there's a 21 related at all with the Guidestones, I guess because of Agenda 21.
No, it's 22 was when they launched it. And some people did say, well, they're launching it because of spring. But spring was the day before, which was a 21, yeah. Here's a few quick bullet points about the Georgia Guidestones. So they're a granite monument. They were erected in 1980, put out in 322. In Elbert County, Georgia. Now, where that is, it's a nice peak where they put them. It's on a peak overlooking the valley there. They have the 10 Commandments, those 10 Commandments that I read when we started. The monument stands at an approximate elevation of 750 feet above sea level, about 90 miles east of Atlanta, 45 miles east from Athens, Georgia, and 9 miles north of the center of the city of Elberton. Now, they mentioned things here about the 6 granite slabs weigh 237,746 pounds, and the anonymity of the Guidestones and their apparent advocacy for population control have made them a target for controversy. True, but what's interesting is this fellow who comes in anonymously and says to the county that he wants to build this, R.C. Christian. There are some people who talked to him, and they said, well, you know, his accent was unmistakably from the Dakotas, which I found interesting because people in the Midwest probably know what a Dakota's accent is all about. I know Dr. Farrell's from the Dakotas. I wonder if he could tell us. But interestingly enough, he was a very clean-cut individual with piercing eyes. That's pretty much all we get about him. It's not a lot to go on. And on some documents, we do have his signature. So he acknowledged that that wasn't his real name, but why would somebody use R.C. Christian? I think it's pretty clear that whoever it is says he's a group in America, and certainly the Rosicrucians came here as far before the Revolution and set up shop. So this idea that the Rosicrucians are behind the Georgia Guidestones, I think, is very valid. I think the Georgia Guidestones are important, and I think that there's some kind of mistranslation or misapprehension of what they are about. And I think this idea that they are calling for population, depopulation is wrong. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that that is, as I said, something that comes out of a kind of a 19th century style mystery school tradition, decree type thing. Maybe they set that up as an ideal for that. Interestingly enough, Steiner himself said he didn't think there was any kind of population problem at that point there in the early 1920s for the world. So it was certainly not one of his tenets. So I think that this is something that people have really pounded over, and maybe it's been intentionally obscured, and they don't want people to look at it in its proper context, which is maybe there's a huge key related to the Georgia Guidestones as opposed to just looking at it as some Illuminati monument. This is, I think, something absolutely crucial. So let's summarize a few points here. The X Steganography takes us through the time capsules relating to advanced technology. It's on record. We've demonstrated it on this program. LBJ, Eisenhower, Nixon all had X-related time capsules relating to advanced technology to be opened in the 21st century because these people wanted to catalog what they were doing. They wanted to catalog their role in the development of this thing. And as I said, when Nixon attempted to bring out that technology and he was redeveloping it through Pine Gap, well, an interesting thing happens through Pine Gap, and I'm just going to stop on this and just jump on this point for a moment. Nixon, in a number of articles in Australia, they say Tricky Dick is working at Pine Gap developing a new energy source to make America energy independent by 1975. One of the interesting things that Merritt told me is that Nixon said to him that he was going to get a third term, which was unprecedented at the time, since in 1950 they had passed this rule under Truman because Eisenhower had had 4 terms, not to let that happen. That's why every president is limited to 2 terms because it's too much of a monopoly. But Nixon said, I'm going to have a third term. And he thought in 76 he was going to run. The only way you can imagine somebody like Nixon, I mean, Nixon wasn't going to seize power and do it. How was he going to do it? If he had brought forward a new energy source that had made America energy independent, then certainly he would have the kind of clout to cause those types of changes in Congress. So these things kind of play into each other when we think about it. What happened instead was they decided he has to go. And, Nixon, through his own blunders and everything else, was railroaded through Watergate. But if what Merritt tells us is true, and as I said, we know he worked as an employee of the Huston Plan, which is close intelligence work with the president. The idea that Nixon had this time capsule that would make America energy independent, I think, is powerful. And it gives us this hint that all of this is about energy. So what happened to kind of mess this process up? Let's look at it. it's a very interesting hubbub going on in the UK about something called the Palace Letters. These letters are in relation to something that happened in Australia in 1975 that was unprecedented, when Gough Whitlam was unceremoniously thrown out as prime minister as an action of the governor general on behalf of the Queen. And this is the article in The Guardian relating to this very, very unusual set of circumstances that popped up. And what they're trying to get at is these letters between the Queen and the Governor General. They're saying, are they private letters, or are they letters that belong in the state purview? They have a law over there that they can get access to those letters. They want to see them because they want to know why the Queen decided to, for the first time, to use the Governor General to throw out a prime minister. Now, Gough Whitlam, this is a quick outline, and for those subscribers in Australia, you're going to know the story quite well, better than I do. But Gough Whitlam was definitely rogue and was quite independent, and he was looking at throwing America out and Pine Gap out of Australia because he felt that it put them on the bullseye. And this was problematic for him because he said, you know, he wanted a different type of government, and he felt like the CIA presence in Australia was growing. So the way that we got this entire situation, the way that this whole thing rolled out is really Gough Whitlam was looking at the situation and saying, we're going to get Pine Gap out of there. And they were like, we really have to get a handle on this, because Pine Gap was originally set up as a space observatory. It became Five Eyes. It became the largest spy satellite station that ever was, and it still is. So what we have to understand about Pine Gap is the reputation and the history. And in my conversations with people like Stan Deyo, I've gotten a pretty good idea of what this is. Stan Deyo also, by the way, had one of the only and deep interviews with President Trump's uncle, John, which is a fascinating account, and knew him quite well. But the whole UFO file redevelopment aspect comes through this Pine Gap. So these letters are very important, and the Queen's snubbing them and keeping them locked up is quite significant. And so the idea is, what was it that happened there that they want to cover up? Well, certainly it could be just politically embarrassing, but maybe it's something deeper. That is something that we can't answer on this program, but I will say this in relation to the Queen. She does not use the Governor General, in this case Sir John Kerr, for that type of activity. They hadn't used that ability in the whole time that Australia had been in existence. So it was definitely an extraordinary situation there in 1975 when the Queen ordered the Governor General to throw out Gough Whitlam, who wanted to get rid of Pine Gap. Gives us some idea that the stories about Nixon developing the alternative energy source there have something to do with this. There's a cross current moving. Let's take a look at the logo for Pine Gap, the Joint Defense Facility, Pine Gap as they call it. And it's a clear X around the world. So these things, you know, it's interesting the way that they develop, because if you're looking, and the way that I understand the steganography around the X is this, you know, if you want to have a group, an intelligence group of say 1,000 people following something without briefing each one about the details because it risks too much security, then you give them the ability to track just a symbol, that is the X in this case. And that way they can track the advanced programs, they can track different aspects of this thing and report back to you and give you information relating to it without knowing what it is. So this is what I think we see over and over again in relation to this. And so I'm going to jump now to another section, but before I do, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, JJK was asking, does anyone know who owns the land where the Georgia Guidestones are?
Well, they definitely set up something where there'd be security there. So when they originally set it up, I mean, I think it was just a basic kind of real estate group for the county. I don't think there's anything particularly special going on in regard to that. If you have other information, I'd love to hear it, but I haven't run across it. That is Gough Whitlam, who maintained till the end that they had basically done something to tweak the Queen, and he felt it was in relation to Pine Gap. Now, that's also interesting, I think, when we look at the background there, because Australia becomes so pivotal in our spying activities going forward, but it becomes pivotal also in deep space radar, deep space, observing what's going on out there. So we needed that right there in that spot. Another weird thing is that spot the Aborigines hold there at Alice Springs is a Dreamtime area. So they already knew in ancient times that this had kind of a mystical significance that was happening. So, they have this whole kind of culture there about where the green ants dream, and they develop information based on going on those journeys with these green ants. So there's a mystical aspect about that whole area that the Aborigines held. So when Pine Gap moves in there, we've already discussed on this program the strange naming convention for Pine Gap comes directly out of Prospero and Shakespeare. So there's a lot of things relating to Pine Gap, I think, that are far more mysterious than something as banal as Area 51. Let's put it that way. Would you ever call Area 51 banal?
Never.
A couple of quick things relating to this. The complete article, I need to actually print that out, but this is one of the articles in the Australian Observer, and this one was called National Review, and it says Pine Gap does scientific work for Tricky Dick. So there were a series of articles like this that they were leaning toward this idea that there was something very significant going on in relation to that. Okay, Olivia, more questions.
Okay, well, let's go back to the Guidestones for a minute. Did you mention the ley lines there at all?
No, it's interesting. I don't have any information relating to the fact that they are
someone
ley
in the
lines.
chat does.
Okay, good.
So Spiritus says, what does DJ understand about how the ley lines relate to places like the Georgia Guidestones, i.e. the line that begins at ancient Baalbek lands very close to the Guidestones? So that's very interesting.
Well, look, there's a great book called The Old Straight Track, which gives us some idea about what ley lines are and how all of these ancient monuments show up on them. So basically a quick outline that these are those magnetic lines that are running underground, and that people with the ancient knowledge understood where they went. So that places in modern times like Cape Canaveral or, any significant spot, Washington, D.C., they're right at the heart of a ley line, for example. Harvard over here is supposed to be running. There's a ley line running right underneath it. And so when we get into England and we're looking at that whole end of the spectrum, you can find all of these churches and ancient standing stones are all on these lines. It's quite remarkable. They understood what it was. In modern times, we on the public level don't know what it is, but you can be damn sure that those in the power structure understand those ley lines quite well. It wouldn't surprise me if they were on a ley line. Let's take a look at Pine Gap for a moment. These are the most incredible, sophisticated stations for gathering knowledge and soaking up every phone call, email, text, foreign communication, detecting bomb explosions, detecting, overflights. And Pine Gap becomes one of the most important international spying stations in the world. But something that the people of Alice Springs know quite well is that there's a huge factor of UFO sightings over Pine Gap, which is either them redeveloping the technology, a la Area 51, or somebody is very interested in their activities. But there is something there relating to the UFO file, which is crucial. And its connection, and the reason we bring it up so much here, is that when we started off with Nixon and the time capsule and all the things that related to that, we had to get a handle on why. So now let's review just a little bit of the Nixon info, and then we're going to roll into your questions. It's really fantastic having everyone here. It's a huge crowd tonight, and I'm very excited. We had a great night last night with Cliff High. Tomorrow night, Dr. Joseph Farrell and his new book, which is quite, let me tell you, in terms of Dr. Farrell's output, this is a very interesting book. And another book I'm going to touch on of his tomorrow night is Thrice Great Hermetica, because we have some questions around the Templars relating to the X factor. So we're really getting something special going here. Let's look here at something I think is significant when we're talking about Nixon. this is a list of dinner dignitaries showing up. That is Dornberger, Walter Dornberger, coming for dinner. Welcome to dinner, Mr. Herr Dornberger. Dornberger is a crucial figure. Dornberger is the developer of the X-15 and the X series. The X series of planes and superjets. And what they call them space planes. But his X-15 still holds the record even now, for speed, even though the test was done in 1962. How does that work? How do you get 55 years of development out and he still holds the record? One of the things, since someone brought up our friend Mr. Corso earlier, is he said the X-15 was developed for one purpose, which was UFO recon. So this being the case, the UFO recon factor was going on inside of NASA. They were developing these planes. Now, Dornberger's presence in a number of unusual things related to Kennedy's assassination is also very compelling. Can't get into all those details here, but I have in previous episodes, including the fact that one of his main proteges at Bell Helicopter was Michael Payne, where Oswald was staying at the apartment. So they're setting up this patsy there. But Dornberger comes out of the Nazi rocket program, and he is, in fact, although we think of von Braun in relation to all this, he is, in fact, von Braun's boss. So he's an even more important figure. And one of the interesting things is that he was set up there at Nuremberg to be hanged for crimes against humanity for using slave labor to build the V-2 rockets. So for him to show up running Bell Helicopter and working on our X series is quite important. Him showing up at the Nixon White House for a personal dinner is also very important, I would say. This took place in 1969. So we're going to roll with that. But in the meantime, let's take some questions with Miss Olivia. I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Okay, I'm going to try to do this by topic. All right,
Okay.
So Imagine This wants to know, do you think that Nixon may have shared what went into his time capsule with President Trump?
Well, I'll put it to you this way. We don't know what the conversations were between Trump and Nixon, but we know this. Nixon moved to New York to be closer to Trump. He was in California. There was no reason for him to go to New York. He'd become very close friends with him. He was encouraging him to run for president. My guess is he was giving him a lot of the back channels for what was going on there in the real political deep state. In terms of the advanced technology aspect and who he shared that with, Merritt said the only person in the world he trusted that information with was Henry Kissinger. That's why he went and got a copy to him. But by the time 15 years or so had passed and he was hanging out with Trump in 1988, those conditions may have changed. And if he felt that somehow his whole image could be redeemed in history as the president who had worked closely on the UFO file and redeveloped this incredible energy source, then it's very likely that he shared that information with Trump. It also seems to me that Trump stands between his uncle, who was the head of the UFO file, at one point working for the head of it, Vannevar Bush, and working with that, and then Nixon on the other side. It shows Trump has an incredible depth of knowledge, which we have no idea when we look at him as just this kind of loud real estate developer. It's quite interesting, actually. It's a great technique. And I think the idea when we look at this is when we're looking at Trump and the Space Force comes in under Trump. The Space Force did not come in under Obama. That's very significant. It was set up somehow, this whole arrangement, for Trump. And Trump has the background. And, you hear all this wild stuff about Trump, he's a time traveler and all this thing. You don't need any of that. His background is very, very compelling. John Trump working for Vannevar Bush alone is very compelling because Vannevar Bush, he was the last word. He was the top man for the UFO file for 10 years under 3 presidents. You don't get any better than that. So, yeah, great question. Okay, keep rolling.
Okay. Kailhar, why does the time capsule have to be at the White House?
It doesn't have to be. It just Robert Merritt said that that's where he put it, and he said that he understood. It's very clever the way that it was placed there. Now I have an update to this from my conversations with Merritt after the fact of our interviews that I'm going to share with you. And but before we get to it, I'm going to do that before the program is over for sure. But before we get to it, let's roll a little bit more with the questions.
Okay.
But I want you to know.
JJK wants to know, so we may never find out about the letter if Henry Kissinger has anything to do with it?
Well, look, I'll tell you what's interesting is there were people who actually reached out to Kissinger in relation to this. Kissinger is probably the last person who'd want to share anything relating to advanced technology and information that he had. He's not the guy who's going to come out and be a whistleblower for us. No way. But it is interesting, I think, that Nixon placed him in such high regard. He wanted to make sure that he had this energy formula. And what I found out, which is quite fascinating, if you look at the work of Bill Steinman, who I cited on this program before for his book, The Aztec UFO Crash, which is an amazing book, actually. And William Steinman is an unusual UFO researcher because he came in, he hit it really hard, he researched a bunch of facts, and he got out. And that book is one of his best legacies. But he went to Robert Sarbarker, who was the physicist who was working on the UFO file with Vannevar Bush and all the rest of it. And Sarbarker didn't hold back. As we've pointed out in this program, the reason Sarbarker became a non-person is because he didn't hold back. I think this is important. And Sarbarker said, of course I worked on redeveloping UFOs. Yeah, I don't even know why that's classified anymore. Everyone probably knows. And he was retired, and he just shot his mouth off to Bill Steinman. And then there was a second corroboration through another UFO researcher. So we have it from two different sources that he said this. It's not just one guy's thing. And it's an actual letter that he sends back on his letterhead. Sarbarker's statement that it was Arthur Compton who took over the UFO file, and then John von Neumann, who took it over after him, shows us the legacy and how it goes. It moves from Vannevar Bush to and who was on the team also. It was also very interesting. And one of the things that Sarbarker said is that they determined that the beings who were operating the craft were insect-like because they had the ability to accelerate. They had to be light like insects to withstand that kind of acceleration. That was one of the things that they were studying. Now, in something called the Prospect for America, which is a group of articles and books that came out from the Rockefellers about how to improve conditions. This is late in the 50s. Prospect for America included things about like race relations, how do we move things forward in a socio-economic fashion, how do we get the corporate thing going, how to move America forward. Well, one of these projects involved the UFO file. And it's very interesting because in Steinman's book, he goes and he finds the professor and the engineer who worked with Henry Kissinger on that aspect of it. And those volumes of Prospect of America are the only 4 volumes that were never released. It's another stealth archive that's just sitting out there, which was this late 50s overview by top scientists, Harvard people, and all the rest of it relating to the UFO file. And it sits out there somewhere. So yeah, very, very compelling stuff. Okay, keep rolling.
Okay, Joseph Farrell wants to know, is it possible that when the White House was cleaned of post-Obama bugs prior to the Trumps moving in, that they were looking for and recovered that time capsule?
Wow. I think it's a very compelling case that that's exactly what happened. But I will say this, that there's information because of the nature of it that I guess this is a good point to release what Merritt mentioned. I made some notes here related to it. So let me read the main points. And I'm hoping to get one more final interview with Merritt to go over this. Here are the crucial points. 1, the time capsule had been placed there in 1972. That's the first important thing. 2, with the information breaking about the time capsule, according to a former intelligence official who still kept in touch with Merritt, that official said to him that they were using thermal imagery equipment on the intelligence side when Trump wasn't occupying the White House to find out where it was. So let me see if I can drill this down. After the fact of our interview, February 14th, and that going out, they became aware of the time capsule information. And for their own sake, they developed a small internal group that would go into the White House and search with thermal imaging for this, which is very much, it's close to what Dr. Farrell was saying in relation to this, because he's saying, well, when they go in to sweep for bugs, after you move from a Democratic administration into a Republican administration, you're going to do that, and that would be a good opportunity for them to recover it. The fact that this source told Merritt that they were using this thermal imaging to discover it inside the walls and around the structure, this is something that I felt it seemed very likely, and that the source who was giving this information to Merritt after all these years really knew what he was talking about. What was interesting is after that, we heard a lot of ricochet stuff about kind of stuff that was supposed to have come from Merritt or whatever it was. And I was never able to confirm that. What I did confirm were my series of notes in discussion with him afterwards, and the fact that President Trump had been made aware of this time capsule. So I think there was a race there between the two of them to figure it out and get their hands on it. Now, in terms of who got it, there were some stories out there that, again, that I cannot confirm and do not come from my conversations with Merritt, that Trump originally had got his hands on it and that the intelligence agencies had been able to take it from him, which is
Take it literally out of his hands,
take it literally
supposedly.
away. Now, I will say this, I can't confirm that, and Merritt has not told me that. So, but I will say that Merritt told me that they were searching on the intelligence side in their own situation, looking for thermal imagery inside the White House to find the time capsule that Nixon had placed there in 1972 to become the disclosure president in 2018, literally. And there's something very interesting about the fact that the information came out here. And this goes into a kind of a, more of a fate conversation, but how interesting it was that Merritt, in all of his conversations, in all of his interviews, and all these different things, he had not released this piece of information, but faced with a terminal diagnosis, decided to reach out and bring this to the public. And we did bring it to the public, and it is there, and it has been covered. But how do you get information? How do you get a follow-up inside the White House in the time capsule? Of course, we had situations where people had sent letters to the National Archives related to this, and there was an offer originally by Merritt to lead them directly to it. But interestingly enough, it seems like they did discover the location, at least, using that thermal imagery. That much, I think, is likely. But certainly they were looking for it. And that's where the situation stands in relation to the Nixon time capsule. I hope to get an update for the last week of November or the first week of December in relation to this. Okay, so let's keep rolling.
Okay, Joseph had a follow-up comment, which is very, very, very suggestive. It means it is not simply a piece of paper, but a heat source.
Oh, excellent point. Yeah, that's a fantastic. True. That's true. That would be a great way to find it using that particular method. Fascinating.
Okay.
Okay.
So do you think that this is related at all to what Trump and Putin are going to discuss next week?
Well, first of all, anytime you get Trump and Putin together and they boot everyone but the interpreters out, you know that they're talking about something significant. And that's when the media hits the roof and says, oh, how dare you do this? Because the media really is doing the work of the CIA there because they want to be in the conversation. And they certainly don't want these guys discussing things on their own. So, yeah, I would say they have those types of deep conversations. I think in relation to the time capsule, it would be a highly prioritized American movement, that it would be something that Trump's administration would talk about internally and work with internally. I don't think it's something that they would share with a foreign power, especially not right off the bat. But I do think it's interesting that the time capsule information came out, and then shortly after, the Space Force was announced. I know that they were going to probably roll out something, but this was a weird rollout because, you can't just make the Space Force by pronouncing it. You have to get 2 houses of Congress to pass it, and you have to create a gigantic bureaucracy to manage it and all the rest of it. So to say, I'm making the Space Force is more of a declaration. It's something that will send shockwaves through the various people that are observing this whole situation. So it's very interesting to me that he bothered saying it. It's a very unusual thing that he said, actually. And in fact, the Russians came forward immediately afterwards and said, hey, that violates everything about, space not being a war-fighting domain. It's supposed to be weapons-free. You're not supposed to weaponize space. We have a treaty from 1968 that LBJ signed. What are you talking about? And so it's quite unusual combination of things. I like to thread those together. I feel that the time capsule aspect is proven in the sense that these other presidents have it. It makes sense to me that Nixon would have it. He was the most inside man. Merritt's credentials of working for Nixon and working in the Huston Plan and being somebody that the Nixon administration used for everything from sexual blackmail to surveillance, seems to me he would be a pretty good messenger for this. And that's why I believe his story. Okay.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go back to the Georgia Guidestones.
Okay.
Okay. So JJK wanted to know, do you know who the small group of Americans are who had the stones built? The small group.
No, R.C. Christian, Rosicrucian Christian, who represented them, obviously, there's a hint there that it's part of the Rosicrucian Mystery School that built them, and that the bad reputation that they have in relation to the population is actually something that was pushed by the media and got hooked into by the alternative media, but is a wrong reading of them. The setup of the Georgia Guidestones and the time capsule and the X Steganography tells me that the group was trying to push something important. It was trying to push a kind of benevolent message, and that the thing about the population aspect is like an ideal that was promulgated at a different era, and it has nothing to do with depopulating. So trying to tie it into an Illuminati monument, I think is a really mischaracterization of the entire thing. If we look at it differently, if we throw all that conspiracy out and just try to figure out what this mystery school Rosicrucian style group was trying to do, we might find something very significant in relation to the fact that we have these 2 factors showing up over and over again, X Steganography and time capsules.
Okay. Spiritus followed up on that ley line question. And said the Baalbek line goes through Stonehenge, the 5 U.S. revolutionary cities, and very close to the Pentagon, the Guidestones, and ends at the Pyramid of the Sun in Mexico.
Oh, that's great.
So what does that tell you?
Whoever said that, email me at info@darkjournalist.com. I'd like to look at that.
Okay. Breach 123 said, isn't there a small square empty area on top of one of the stones? And Lake Wolf White Crow said everyone there got a piece of it when they removed that cube. Who were those people?
They were just sent in there by the people who maintain it for the county after the fact. Like I said, they have security cameras and everything else. I haven't found anything unusual about those people who went in there and removed it. And I would expect if somebody put something on top of the Georgia Guidestones, which is kind of a hard thing to do, but I can see them just sending a group in and saying, get that out of there. I want to give you a little quick background relating to Merritt, Nixon, and the things that were going on around the time that he placed the time capsule. This is a very interesting and strange story. Here's the headline from the Miami Herald. Nixon's housekeeper shoplifted in trance.
I forgot about this. This is incredible.
All right. Now, when I've done episodes on X Protect, this is something I've focused on. But in this context, it's very important. Let's imagine for a second Nixon is acting completely independent and rogue. He goes forward with the time capsule idea and plan, and he has this energy independence formula that he's going to work through Pine Gap and supply this totally different energy system, and he's going to run for a 3rd term in 1976 for the bicentennial. And we have a whole new form of energy. There are all these oil crises, the Arab oil crisis in 1973 that plunged markets and everything else. He will be looked at as a hero. strange things start to happen around the Nixon White House, Watergate in particular, which is very, very unusual even now. And we know that the people involved in exposing it, like Bob Woodward, are military intelligence assets. That's on record now. He worked in military intelligence. Okay. Quote, a part-time housekeeper at President Nixon's Key Biscayne retreat has testified she was put in a hypnotic daze by a stranger who told her to shoplift 4 dresses. Shirley Cromartie, 32, and a mother of 3, pleaded no contest and was given a suspended sentence after law enforcement officers and a psychiatrist testified they believed she was telling the truth. Mrs. Cromartie holds a security clearance to work in the Florida White House, according to testimony. She said a woman met her in a parking lot and asked her the time, then ordered her to take the items and bring them to her. Mrs. Cromartie testified she fell into a daze. When the young woman released a jasmine-like scent from her left hand, she was told to take the dresses for her children, Mrs. Cromartie said. I just sort of lost my will. Okay. That'll send you a message. Your housekeeper's pretty close to you. I mean,
She knows all your dirty little secrets.
Well, if they can mess with your housekeeper, you're kind of finished. Dragging her through the courts, her being hypnotized and put in a trance, I think is a really heavy, heavy message from this very, very deep group. Not just some piece of the CIA, but a really interesting group that I'm referring to, X-Protect, that deals directly with the UFO file and the energy aspect and seems to put the clamp down on. Let's think of Nixon in a slightly different context. We know about him. We know the history. We know the battles that he had. We know the whole Dirty Tricks campaign. We know the era that he was in with Vietnam and all the rest of it. But let's look at him as someone who wanted to cement his place in history. After all, he developed the EPA, which people on all sides of the political fence enjoy. He did things like wage controls. I mean, he really played a number of different sides of the fence. He was a political ace in many ways, right up to the end, and he was a real hardcore insider. Robert Merritt, key figure working on the Huston Plan, came forward here on this program to tell us all that Nixon had hidden a time capsule inside the White House that related to this advanced energy formula developed from the UFO file. Merritt went on record with a number of his own misdeeds, and I think it's quite compelling. The episode in question is Nixon's ET time capsule. This is the episode. You can find it on my channel. And I do suggest you watch it if we want to get more answers around this. The initial update that I have, as I stated earlier, is that the Central Intelligence Agency was working to develop, when Trump was not in the White House, a small team to do thermal imaging inside the White House in order to find this time capsule. And that Nixon, and that Trump himself was aware that this time capsule existed and was placed in the White House by Nixon, his friend. Okay.
So there's a really interesting idea here.
Okay.
I think this is great.
Yes.
Bo Krill says time capsule or free energy device. And Nick Nelson says, could the Nixon time capsule possibly relate to the handbag of the gods?
Oh, that's from an interesting, yeah, that's the what we got from the work of Graham Hancock and incorporated.
Well, there's an idea that handbag is almost like an iPod.
Like a portable energy device, yes,
An
absolutely.
iPod today.
An iPod, I like
That's
the way you
old
think.
school.
Yeah. Let's think about this. What I do think is important about what was just said there is the way it's presented is that the time capsule was a letter because the letter went to Kissinger. However, what Nixon was referencing actually, we don't know because, of course, Merritt didn't see him hide the time capsule in the White House. He told him that he had done it and that he had put it in a place where nobody was going to find it until the time was right. That's pretty interesting. The story itself, I think, is very compelling because I can tell you from many hours of conversation with Merritt, he's not particularly interested in the UFO topic. It wasn't like he wanted to come out and be some UFO whistleblower. It was almost an inconvenient story to tell, a very inconvenient story to tell. So that's something to keep in mind. I do want to say, and I'll show this picture of Admiral Bobby Inman here, very important figure. Admiral Bobby Inman admitted in the late 80s, well, he was the deputy CIA director under Reagan in 1982, but he admitted that we had redeveloped, this might have been some kind of a test pilot idea, the trial balloon to see how the public would react, but he said that we had redeveloped alien technology in the UFO file, and that they had worked on incorporating that energy into other craft that we were doing experimentally on our side. There was this dance that was going on. By the way, since the Kennedy assassination anniversary, the 55th, is coming up on November 22nd, I should definitely mention here that the person that Bobby Inman is standing next to is the gentleman that was in charge of the Oswald project as far back as 1963, and that's him getting a Lifetime Achievement Award. Pretty good job. So when you look at what the CIA is doing, there's always the political intrigue mixed with the UFO aspect. That's why when we see groups like the TTSA and they're coming out and saying something, and then all of these CIA people show up as part of the company, you know you're dealing with that factor again. Okay, let's keep rolling.
Holy cannabis oil says it sounds like scopolamine. I think is how you pronounce that. The
yes, that's that drug that just puts you in a total.
Is that what you think?
Well, listen, the things that the CIA had access to in 1972.
Yeah, we don't even know.
I mean, you know, they've had access to that stuff for a long, long time. So yes, but that's a good comparison. I think it would be the same type of idea. Absolutely.
Okay. And Quasga Ciso says, what do you think the 8-minute gap in his audio tape was about?
I have always felt, now it could be about anything, and anyone, it's an 18-minute gap that shows up in the Watergate tapes, which is very unusual because the Watergate tapes reveal so many things relating to Nixon, you know, doing questionable activities, that how do you get what could be so bad that you would wipe out 18 minutes? I mean, it has to be something really, really incriminating. And my guess is that it relates to the alternative energy project because he felt it was still something that would redeem him in the future and didn't want it to come out then. That's the way I look at it. And I also think there may be an aspect that relates to the JFK assassination in there. There's no question in my mind that Nixon was removed by the same forces with a different method. Because again, he's getting close to that UFO file. He inhabited that world of the UFO file because when he was part of CIA Project Blue Book, that's 1958. So that's 15 years earlier, before Watergate. He's already deep, deep in that development. And if he thinks he's going to bring forward an alternative energy source, working through Pine Gap, developing it, he's going rogue in a sense. He's developing this thing, and then he's going to go to Congress directly and say, make it so that they can vote me in for a third term. I've got the alternative energy solution. This sounds to me like Nixon. And I think there's enough compelling evidence about his reemergence with Trump, which is documented now. So people can't say that's some kind of conspiracy theory. I've got the documents. I've got their letters. I've got their pictures. So we're looking at something very, very unusual. Okay, Miss Olivia.
Okay, Esoteric 369 Wall. Might Merritt be being allowed to disclose his information to you?
Is he being allowed to?
Deliberately.
I would say this. Merritt had not disclosed the information before, and that's significant to me because when he wrote a book earlier in 2012 working with Douglas Caddy, and when he'd done radio interviews and all these other things, this did not come up. And when he was cited in books, there's a famous book from 1984 on Watergate, he wasn't talking about it. But I think coming up with a terminal diagnosis and looking at the end of his life and thinking about Nixon, I think he wanted to get it out in the public realm. And whenever I spoke to him about it, I can't emphasize this enough, there are certain things that you understand as a journalist about how to get somebody to change their story if it's not real. And I used every technique in the book in our conversations along that line, and over again, his account came up absolutely spotless. So whatever he was trying to tell us the three major factors are this. Nixon had planned for a third term using this alternative energy source, and he had developed in the UFO file this alternative energy formula. And that when Watergate hit, he realized that this was the kind of the crowbar to take it away from him. And then he made sure Kissinger got a copy, and he hid a copy in the White House so that nobody else could get their hands on it, but that at some point people would find it and they would understand that he was the one who had created the whole thing, and he would go down in history as that great president that he wanted to be. It's a very, very compelling case that Robert Merritt lays out in the Nixon ET Time Capsule episode, and I do highly recommend it. It is graphic because of the number of things that Merritt was compelled to do for the Nixon administration and for his FBI and intelligence work before that and for the Huston Plan. But wow, what a very eye-opening thing, and I think it is the story of 2018.
Scribbles 4444 says, does DJ think that the powers that be are afraid of disclosure to reveal that Earth as a whole is still under some form of cosmic treaty like the one JPF speaks about in his SSP presentations?
Oh, isn't that interesting? Well, look, in 2015, our friend Dr. Joseph Farrell put something together which gave us the idea that there was a kind of a treaty out there that had been done, which harkened back to some of the treaties that we'd made, like the Treaty of Versailles, for example. And it had to do with working with off-planet groups. And that there was a kind of, I would like to think of it as almost like a quarantine. What I recommend people do is that presentation is available, actually. And it is a very interesting case, but it relates to the Cosmic War series that Dr. Farrell has written about. I've always felt that there's enough information to suggest that, especially the fact that we went to the moon and then, we did these little programs going up there and that was it. After the early 70s, no more trips to the moon for almost 50 years now. It's absurd. I mean, how would somebody justify that except to say that there's some other aspect? Let's not forget that, Reagan, at a certain point, they show him these incredible images of these ships on the rings of Saturn, and he freaks out. And as Catherine Austin Fitts says, that's when all the fraud and all the stuff in Iran-Contra goes off the charts. So it's very interesting when we look at it that way, that they're dealing with something out there. And what was it that President Gorbachev confirmed in front of an audience with Charlie Rose, and Henry Kissinger was there? And he said, he broke out of the whole style of the thing, and he said, what happened during that conversation I had with Reagan at Reykjavik? He took me aside and he stood at me. He stood and looked at me very seriously, and he said, if we get attacked by this alien force, will you help us? And Gorbachev was freaked out, but he said, yeah, of course. And Reagan said, good, we'll help you too. So when he confirmed that, by the way, they were freaked out. I mean, there's a picture they show of Henry Kissinger, and it looks like he's going to die on the spot. It's amazing. And Charlie Rose starts to laugh, and he's like, the aliens got you, whatever. And it's a very interesting moment, but it's on the record now. Reagan talked to Gorbachev directly about an alien invasion, which is quite remarkable under any circumstances. So I think these things, we have to see it. When you talk about disclosure and things like that, I think what we have to see here is that the whole idea of disclosure being some kind of emancipation of people learning about this interstellar off-planet groups that come here, it's actually different. The disclosure, I think, that we really need is why they are doing all these other things to cope with that. It explains a lot, like it would open up the whole conversation about what's going on with our government and why there's two levels, this kind of covert thing down here running the show on the overt government. And there's a schizophrenic situation right now where we're completely in this thing where these guys, on the people who are running the show have access to all this information that we just, on the public level, we don't get any of it. So it's too much of a schizophrenic situation. And the best cure for that is what Winston Churchill used to say, which is, tell the people the truth. At the end of the day, tell the people. I think that's probably the cure, because at a certain point, it's getting more and more absurd, right? They're going to start building space elevators, and we have this whole space force, and they're going to run everything on planet Earth from space. And then we're looking at the situation with Trump and the Space Force and the secret space program. We're going to have a conversation about it as a nation and as a world eventually. So there's no time like the present. Okay, keep rolling.
I'm curious, did you ever talk to Gigi about the Georgia Guidestones?
No, but Gigi is coming back with us. It's great to have you out there, Gigi. Gigi is such a valuable asset for the X series. I can tell you when we've done the work that requires the kind of sensitive work that she can do, peering into these things, it's quite remarkable, because I think in a lot of academic readings around things like the mystery schools or the Orphic Circle, you don't really get a handle on it unless you get somebody who has those types of abilities. And so Gigi's been absolutely great. And she's coming back on November 30th with a really compelling story, and it relates directly to the time capsule aspect. And that's all I'm going to say about that. But she's going to be back on the 30th.
Well,
Okay,
I'm gonna ask Gigi right now, because she's in the chat, what she thinks about the Georgia Guidestones, because I have to say my intuition is completely different from yours. I think it is nefarious. I think it is.
Okay, well, Gigi says there she's going to be reporting on the Guidestones in the next show. That's
great.
good.
Okay.
So you can't have her peer at it now. I mean, here she is. She's in the chat.
She may have already thought about it. She's there in Georgia.
No, the nefarious thing is interesting. I'll tell you. It seems to me that that's a projection on top of what they made the Guidestones for. Of course, interpreting people's, intentions is tricky. But I will say, if it is R.C. Christian and he's doing the Rosy Cross thing, and the majority of the things that are written there on the stones are pretty benevolent, and they relate to spiritual principles, and they're citing things like the Babylonians and the Egyptians, my guess is they're hearkening back to the ancient builder guild, and that the Guild of Builders, and that takes us into this very interesting area of the mystery schools and the Masonic tradition. And we know that they take left turns along the way, but I think it's the idea of holding this knowledge and carrying this knowledge over time, and that takes us into this X Steganography over and over again. Okay, keep rolling.
I have a kind of a wild card to throw at you. Alex George wants to know, what is Neil Armstrong's game? He tried to stop Elon Musk's rocket launches. I don't know anything about that.
There are a lot of really wild games going on with Elon Musk right now. Mostly they were hitting at him from every side. And he came out and did an interview. What is it about the Joe Rogan show that when people go on there, it's a disaster for them? Company lost $4 billion because he was sitting there smoking pot, saying that he wasn't sure if he could pull the company off. I think he's done some very interesting things. I think they have a problem with him now. And it seems to me that it's either like play ball with us in space, don't act independently. We've set up this infrastructure. We're just using you as a puppet, basically. That when he shows some variation, or when he mouths off on Twitter or whatever, they don't like that. So, they've made little motions against him. They've removed him as chairman of SpaceX, even though he continues to have the major role there. It seems to me there's a lot of pushback on SpaceX, but they were the first one out the door. And the fact that the X Steganography is all over this guy and his company, I think is significant. So it's hard when you get on that level to see what's going on. I do want to say that it's very unusual and confusing on Musk, and I cite this a lot because he warned us. He said, I've been warning you about AI for 10 years. And he's right. He has been a leading voice on that, warning about that kind of transhumanism. But now he's talking about uploading his consciousness into a little box with Neuralink and that kind of thing, and how that's going to be an avatar. We can do that. which shows an incredible lack of spiritual understanding. 'Cause, you can't project your consciousness into a box. Your consciousness operates as a result of your endocrine system with your chakra system. And, anyone who understands the mystery schools understands that. So it's a very strange suggestion. So there's a lot of very unusual things, I think, in relation to the SpaceX project and Musk in particular. And he's under a tremendous amount of pressure now. That much I think I've noticed. So yes, great questions tonight. By the way, I want to remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here going deep. This is our second episode in a row. We have a 3 broadcast marathon going on here. Last night was the Secret Space Program controversy with Cliff High. Tonight is the Time Capsule episode with an update from the Robert Merritt situation and the incredible time capsule links with Georgia Guidestones. And then tomorrow night is Dr. Joseph Farrell, which is going to be absolutely fascinating with his new book on mind control, and also bringing him deeper into the Templar X mystery. And so many of the great things from what I have to say is one of my favorite books of Joseph's, which is Thrice Great Hermetica. This is a compelling book that takes us all the way from the Templars to Akhenaten to Christopher Columbus. I mean, if you really want a fascinating history, that's the book to get. So we're rolling now hardcore. We're going to take a few more questions, and then we're going to then I'm just going to wrap it up here, but let's take a look.
Okay, a cult fan would like you to comment on Elon Musk's background funders.
Well, this is interesting because it gets very tricky, because we have Tesla motor vehicles, we have SpaceX, so you get into a lot of different things. I promise you this, though. I'm going to do a show on SpaceX, and as part of the X series, and we're going to get into that because there's a transhumanist aspect that's creeping in there that wasn't there when it started. So that's where you're going to get, I guess, the best answers there.
Okay, I
good question though. Good question.
I've seen this. Do you want to talk about is it Oumuamua? Like, what? How do you? I've seen it written, but I haven't heard anybody pronounce it. That thing.
I think my answer is no.
You know what I'm talking about.
I do.
You don't want to address it?
I think we'll get more into that as we move along. Okay.
Okay. How about phase?
No, this is this incredible thing that's floating around in space. You do make the case on it. They know that it wandered in from another system, and now, actually, it's a good thing you brought it up. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's just, you're going to make me laugh with the pronunciation. Now, let's do this. Basically, what happened was this thing wandered in from another system, and it looks like a very, very strange and unusual meteorite. It's long, it's oblong, and Harvard scientists out of the blue said, it's an alien probe. There's a weird thing that they do when they test the pulse of the public. They want everyone to freak out and run to it and be like, oh my God, scientists suggest it's an alien thing. And then you get there and it's like, scientists say this meteorite, could be anything. For all they know, it's an alien probe, haha, But they put this twist on it to see this idea. Can we put Harvard scientists next to UFO and see how that works and see what kind of reactions we get? So they're drawing data all the time. I think it's an important thing for us to keep in mind. And it is a weird mystery, and that thing I think is very unusual looking. By the way, I mentioned Prospect from America earlier, and I didn't have the image with me, but there it is. That is the document that was developed by the Rockefeller Foundation. They developed a series of 6 different parts dealing with race and economy and all this stuff. The 4 parts that dealt with advanced technology and UFOs remain at the Rockefeller Library in a vault. There's another stealth archive that we know that it's there, but those are private. And we know that Kissinger ran it because of Bill Steinman's work in the Aztec UFO book, who also found out for us about Robert Sarbarker, the physicist who confirmed that the UFO file had been worked on by top physicists like himself, Vannevar Bush, and Oppenheimer. Okay, that's good.
Rebecca Person says...
Hi, Rebecca.
Says Dr. Frank Stranges revealed in his lectures that Eisenhower and Nixon had met Val Thor, who was from Venus and who lived at the Pentagon for 3 years. The erased tape may have referred to this?
Look, I've always felt the Val Thor story is very interesting and unusual. It's sort of an urban legend, but then again, I think the Venus thing is odd. It seemed to be the order of the day whenever we got around the alien question that somebody was a Venusian. Quite interesting. The idea that Val Thor is a real person comes to us as a story from a number of PR people related to around the White House. And Frank Strange's was a preacher who had access to the Pentagon and stuff. It seems like an unusual thing for a preacher to make up a story about an alien for the hell of it. So there's certainly something to the Val Thor story, and the idea that, you know, he came to Nixon and Eisenhower and said, we're from another group. And, you know, we've heard these stories about Eisenhower meeting with aliens, and there's, again, very interesting researchers like Stanton Friedman believe that story. You take a nuclear physicist like Friedman, he finds compelling threads that tell him that Eisenhower did have this encounter. We have to take that seriously. That's not just somebody off the top of their head doing it. It's a nuclear physicist who's big in the UFO research column telling us this is the way that it went down. Very, very interesting stuff.
Okay, I know you've talked about this before, but George Ivankovich says Nixon showing Jackie Gleason an alien body. Jackie's wife said he was never the same. Thoughts?
Well, look, Jackie was never the same. I listened to a 1958 program, okay, John Nebel and his show, which was the original Coast to Coast. That's from 1958. Jackie Gleason calls in and talks for 90 minutes about UFOs. It's a very, very unusual thing for a guy like that to do. He was obsessed with the subject. And the story goes that we know he was close friends with Nixon. And the story goes that Nixon kind of wanted to show off. They escaped from Secret Service. He drove him to the Florida Air Force Base where they were keeping these beings and showed them to him. And when Jackie Gleason came back to his wife, who tells us the story later after she's divorced from Gleason, and that he was so disturbed about seeing them, and that Nixon had said, this is part of the UFO file work that we've been doing. This is from a crash retrieval. And he described bodies that looked like children, essentially. So I've always felt that story was absolutely true. And again, it shows Nixon's deep involvement with the UFO file. I think it's undeniable. And I think that Merritt's story is important because we have the history of Nixon from whistleblowers and Linda Moulton Howe's work saying that Nixon had run CIA Blue Book. I mean, that's the heart of the UFO file, 1958. Through Area 51, it was the liaison between Eisenhower and the Area 51 people who try to keep information from Eisenhower. And, you know, when Eisenhower left office, he sits down with Kennedy and basically says, I've lost this thing. You know, this thing is out of my control. And Kennedy spends his entire presidency trying to get control back over that. And that's where you get all of this stuff about the secret space program. And, you know, I had a document here last night, which is the first document that announces 2 space programs. And it's Kennedy talking to McNamara and saying, look, you know, what's going on with Blue Gemini? Why don't we have control over that program? Don't we run NASA? Like, who's getting the money and doing this? There's a group in there of aerospace companies that are running things like the X-15 and doing UFO recon and all the rest. So Kennedy's determined to get control back for the president, for the government. And you can see the 3 years of his presidency play out like that. It's very important, I think, when we look at Trump and the Space Force, he's trying to do the same thing. And he's up against the exact same group that took over back then. So I think it is important to look at it in this context, the deeper story of what's happening there. I mean, why does the CIA freak out about Trump even before he got in? They didn't mind Obama. They loved G.W. Bush. Why did they freak out at Trump? Because they don't want to share what they know. And they know that he's not going to be a puppet. Now, he might be a lot of things. And even if you disagree with his presidency, I can appreciate it. What I'm trying to point out is his independence is the factor. He had his own money coming in. He had his own political base. He had Nixon's knowledge. He had his uncle John Trump's knowledge of the UFO file. I mean, that's a lot. For the deep state and the CIA and the aerospace companies to be up against that, no wonder they want to get rid of him. They want a puppet back in there. They'd love Pence instead, I'm sure. Okay, keep rolling.
Carl Jung said, is basically Space Force going mainstream due to China's advancement in space?
I thought you were quoting Carl Jung.
No.
I was like, Carl Jung
Sorry, that
talked
was
about the
confusing.
Space Force? That's good. I know Carl Jung wrote a book on UFOs, which is a pretty interesting thing for a guy like him to do. Look, India's got a space program. China's got a space program. Those guys want to go to the moon. We haven't shared our intel about what happens when you go there, obviously. This stuff's going to be coming out. Catherine Austin Fitts, over the summer, put out The Space Economy, Who's Who and What's What. We did a series of episodes on it. If you want to know what's happening on the ground in reality in relation to space, it's in there. It's in her reports. It's a space economy that's blowing up. Asteroid mining asteroids for water, space tourism, all these different aspects. There is a real aspect in space that's developing around us. Spaceports here on the ground. Why are they developing those? Low Earth orbit satellite control is expanding dramatically. The global control grid, and finally Elena Freeland's space fence. We're going to have her on the program talking about it. But of course, we've talked with her about it in interviews before. We're in a different paradigm. We have to get out of the mainstream days about this stuff and get information on the ground. By the way, we also need to get rid of the charlatans and circus freak shows around these things that are muddying the waters up in the alternative field, because this is very important stuff, and you're not going to find it in the mainstream. You're going to find aspects in the mainstream that they have to talk about. But, the missing trillion aspects, the missing trillions aspect that Secretary Fitts brings forward, that's really where the action is. Because if trillions are missing from the government and we're trillions in debt, and there's a space program where that money is disappearing into, then it's a very valid political issue. The hypothetical aspect goes out the window. And that's why I think there's so much pushback on that. Okay, keep rolling.
Scribbles was asking about the Denver airport.
That's great.
Which could be its own episode. There's no question.
It is. There's no doubt the imagery used there. What I heard on this is what I'm going to give you scruples on this, is that they understood that the water levels were rising around Washington, D.C., which is right on the coast, and that within 40 years, that would be about 10 feet underwater. So they're setting up an alternate Washington, D.C. in Denver, and that part of those underground tunnels and things that they built in this incredible expanse of the Denver airport, which is very unusual, even though we have a lot of conspiracies about it that take it, over the top. There's something very unusual about the imagery that they used in relation to the setup of that. There were people who've come forward who worked for the Denver airport and said they were building massive tunnels underground. And we know there's a gigantic underground economy that we in the public sphere don't get to see. So that's called overt government on top and covert government on the bottom. And unless we see what they're up to, we're out of luck, because they're moving, they're developing, and they're using our money to do it. So, we have a right to take a look. That's the way I would look at it. But yeah, Denver, that's the new DC. That would be the way I would look at it. Okay, keep rolling.
Okay.
Miss Olivia, really getting the good questions today.
Sarabella Gignac.
Sarabella.
Says Elon Musk's grandfather was head of Canada's technocracy movement. The mysterious familial lineage of Elon Musk, child of the Illuminati, set in place to move masses towards AI algorithmic enslavement. Absolutely.
I'm working on an episode on Elon Musk, which I think is very important. And if you have anything you want to contribute, please send it to me at info@darkjournalist.com. There's a big story to be told there. There's no question about it. And a guy like Musk now actually is kind of in trouble unless he plays ball. And I think there's some signs that he is playing ball. Wow. Okay. Fantastic questions. It's a great crowd tonight. We have over 2,000 people here, which is fantastic. And we have a great, so many fantastic viewers out there. And of course, Joseph Farrell and Gigi Young are out there.
Cliff High.
Cliff High. Hi, Cliff. It's great to have you last night. And also Is Carly out there? Did she make it?
She went to bed, but she was here earlier.
Carly's 5 hours ahead of us, so I can appreciate that. But don't worry, Carly, the rest will be waiting for you. It's great to have everyone out there. We're rolling now to the end of this episode, dealing with the time capsule. It's a very important issue. We're going to come back in late November and early December talking about it. It's a very special episode coming up on November 30th with Gigi Young. And tomorrow night, however, we have Dr. Joseph Farrell and the Templars and Mind Control. So you're not going to want to miss that. It's at 6 p.m. though. It's quite a different thing because Saturday night, that's just the way we roll. Okay, Olivia, the last two questions.
Okay. Did Steiner write or discuss any influence from Francis Bacon?
Of course. He wrote extensively about Francis Bacon, and he cited his Rosicrucian influence. I want to go back to Steiner, actually, since you mentioned him, because I never got to the crux, and I thank you for rescuing me here. I started off with two very unusual things. First, I want you to notice something in how I was tying Rudolf Steiner into the Georgia Guidestones. One, the strange cube that was put on the Georgia Guidestones in 2014 reminded me very much of this unusual design that comes directly out of anthroposophy, which are these forces holding this cube here. That's what I thought of when I saw that strange 20 cube. That's one. Two, Steiner had a number of mystical experiences before he started anthroposophy and became the prolific genius at the University of Vienna and beyond. He was incredibly influenced by Goethe, who was that Renaissance man we discussed, and also Furcher von Steinmann, who is here, this incredible German poet, who's deep in the occult. And what happened is he met this poet and he had a very interesting interaction with him that convinced him that this was a spiritual adept that he was dealing with. Now, he also had the same feelings about Goethe. Now, both of these people, after he had set up anthroposophy, would have a very fascinating role in delivering a message to him in that spiritual world, shall we say. And before I say it, I'm going to mention this, which relates to Nikola Tesla and Goethe. Not everyone understands that Tesla got alternating current from reading, got the idea for alternating current from reading Goethe's poem. Let's read the poem real quickly. Tesla used to recite the passage by heart because when he read it, he was walking with a friend and he had this realization. It came into his head and he stopped on the ground with a stick and drew out the formula for alternating current, which is what lights up the world today. Remember, direct current that Edison had developed was this sloppy, slow thing where you needed a generator every 50 feet. That wasn't going to work. How are you going to ignite the world with electricity that way? It's alternating current that Tesla built that gave us everything that we're doing tonight. So let's think of it that way. Here's the poem that inspired him to develop alternating current. Quote, "The glow retreats, done as the day of toil. It yonder hastes, new fields of life exploring. Ah, that no wing can lift me from the soil upon its track to follow, soaring." Follow and follow made him realize that the current could go up and then go around again. That's where we get alternating current. This is very important because there's more to that poem, which is quite remarkable. And what's interesting is it's cited in his biography here that the passage Tesla quotes is about a dream of flying beyond the sun, the heavens, into eternal daylight. And Tesla finds the metaphor, the parallel between the dream and the priority for humankind. Now, that's Goethe's poem. So Goethe had given us that spiritual inspiration through Tesla to get alternating current. Now, here's an interesting thing. When did they launch the Georgia Guidestones? Earlier. I cited it, and it's confirmed. 3/22. That's a very unusual date, interesting date, I would think, to choose to launch the Georgia Guidestones. 1980, March 22nd, 3/22. Goethe died on 3/22. Goethe appeared to Steiner in a vision. And remember, Steiner said anthroposophy was the stream of Rosicrucian thought. Furcher von Steinmann was born on 322. Steiner met him, but later he appeared to Steiner in a vision, letting him know about world wars and things that were going to happen. The 322 date, I always look when I'm dealing with the mystery schools, when they inaugurate things, they will use the right dates. And in this case, the work of Steiner in that Rosicrucian stream and the Rosicrucians coming forward, giving us the Georgia Guidestones, R.C. Christian, and the Ten Commandments and the hieroglyphs, the Babylonian cuneiform, connecting that up with the birth dates and the death dates of these two individuals who opened Steiner's spiritual eye, tells me directly that this whole Georgia Guidestones thing is the work of the Rosicrucians, which means it's a mystery school that put it up. So let's keep that in mind and remember that with Goethe inspiring Tesla and giving us alternating current, the Georgia Guidestones and the capsule, the time capsule, in this period of time, saying this time capsule to be opened blank, and then the knowledge that there are all these time capsules from these presidents relating to the UFO file disclosure. There's something in the stream of all this. This is how the mystery schools work. They'll give you all the information, and you have to open it up. It's like a box that you have to unravel, and they will give you those keys and the steganography to get there. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions and we're out.
David Tormina said, we should have thought of this, that date is what is known as the Pisces-Aries cusp, the point between water and fire. 322.
Oh, yeah, I like that, actually, because that's how they think.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to look at astronomical, they're going to look at astrological aspects, numerological aspects. There's no question about it. So that's an excellent observation.
He also adds fire and water, cold fusion.
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Well, it's funny because there's a lot of different things I think that you can open up to about that. And of course, I cited earlier that 322 is the number that Skull and Bones uses. So they understand the significance of it. How they were using it, I'm not sure, but it seems to me there's something related to that. When you deal with the Rosicrucians, you know, you can't, if they're going to do something this important on American soil, they're going to make, the date is going to be significant. And when you find that significance in their lineage through the figure of Rudolf Steiner, I think we have the key there. And if we study the lives of these two individuals, remember, Goethe wrote Faust, and it is from Faust that Steiner identifies Ahriman separate from Lucifer and says that the devil Mephistopheles in Faust is Ahriman, very different from Lucifer. Those two things, those separating those two challenges for humanity is very important. The other thing is that in The Green Snake and the Lily, it's an esoteric, it's one of those esoteric poems that, and stories that reaches just like Alice in Wonderland. It's the control, again, of the mystery schools being able to reach that higher emotional center that we have. If you read The Green Snake and the Lily, it's very unusual, and it has a very unusual effect, I think, on someone who reads it, just like Faust does, of course. Faust is probably Goethe's most celebrated work. But one thing we have to keep in mind is that a young Steiner, 19 years old, had that awakening through these figures of Faust and Furcher von Steinmann.
They love his mullet.
This is the weird thing about Steiner. He looks thoroughly modern in his own strange way. It's like there are times when he shows up and we look at him and you think this guy could be like in Silicon Valley or something. Mm-hmm. He's definitely a man out of time, and his work has this incredible impact. And I think that he is the open door from the mystery schools into the public. And I think that's the anthroposophical tradition. Bring kind of brings that entire picture to us in a better way than any other organization ever did on the esoteric side. A lot of esoteric organizations get mired in this controversy. In theosophy, everybody's fighting everybody. And I'm not saying anthroposophy didn't have some of those battles, because, of course, at the end of his life, Steiner reincorporated anthroposophy, giving it a different kind of dynamic and power structure. But anthroposophy really came through, I think, with the mission, without a lot of the controversy. And I think that's because of Steiner's leadership. But Steiner's crucial spiritual visionaries being part of that 322, and then the Georgia Guidestones being launched on that date, for me, brings that whole piece around. And then I think the time capsule aspect relating to the Georgia Guidestones is missed, is just something that's been left out, let's say. Okay, we'll take the last question.
Okay, Najat Madri wants to know, have the Rosicrucians contacted DJ?
Well, it's one of those things where I have a very interesting story to tell. I'm going to tell about this interesting story where I drove cross country with Olivia, and we had to stop in Ohio. And
Car broke down.
Yeah, and I want to tell you this is a very interesting story, because when we went into this bookstore, and it was just kind of something to do, and it was at night, and this very unusual person came in, and I had gone in there, and I realized that the bookstore carried a book called All and Everything, which is based on the Sarmung Gurdjieff's experience with the Sarmung Brotherhood. And this person very, very unusually came up to me and gave me and asked me for a book, which was a strange thing. And he was a strange looking character. I think, Olivia, if you remember him.
I do. I remember.
It's very unusual looking. And he said that he wanted the name of the book that he wanted, and he said the title, and I said, isn't that interesting, because that's the original title of the book, but it's not the published title. So this is somebody who obviously knows the subject quite well. But this guy kind of looked like, he was in wasn't it like a Grateful Dead t-shirt or something, and he had long hair, and he would be the last person you would suspect, really, in a sense, going for this material. It didn't seem right. And his level and depth of knowledge of the book and its publication was very unusual. And the way that he was following me around in the store was unusual. And there was no one else in the store. So we both looked at him, and then he sort of, I mentioned the book, and I said, oh, well, I have the copy of it. It has a different title now. And then he said, oh, forget it. And then he left. And as we went to buy the book at the bookstore, the guy who was running the bookstore said, yeah, I've never seen that guy before. And he didn't buy a book. He just ran out of here. So these are the way I think those types of contacts work. I'll put it to you that way.
What was the signal? What was the meaning of that exchange?
You remember the person.
I remember the vibe.
He was
the air was thick.
He was a very unusual person who was just staring.
Mm-hmm.
And his the in-depth knowledge that he had about All and Everything, this whole account of Gurdjieff and then Meetings with Remarkable Men, is how it got, it was 3 different books. And that's all about the Sarmung Brotherhood. And it's just the kind of thing that they would do, I would think. So, yeah, I guess that's the way I look at those types of contacts. No, very much. I think that, there's no question that I'm a troublemaker, and I go looking for interesting contacts, shall we say. But I'm just like any other journalist who's looking for kind of a
didn't you get an invitation, though, to some Rosicrucian temple somewhere?
Well, when we cover the subjects, actually, some very interesting people do show up on the radar. And I actually think that the work of the anthroposophists and the Rosicrucians, and people who work on the Gurdjieff work, all of this stuff, I think, has the chance to come together because of the prediction that Rudolf Steiner made in 1916, saying that in 100 years, if anthroposophy and the mystery schools failed, and he felt that they were failing because World War I was hitting really hard in Germany, that they would have this opportunity, this door would open, a 20 to 30 year opportunity would open up for the whole thing to rise again. And I think there's no question, absolutely no question, that we're right in the middle of that wave. And this is the vital information I think that we need. So with that, I will say we had a fantastic time with everyone. I want to invite everyone to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter to keep us in touch with each other and to really, get you guys involved in what we're doing, get behind the show. We're coming back tomorrow night with Dr. Joseph Farrell, and that's going to be a fantastic episode at 6 p.m. Eastern. And it'll be the tail end of our 3-episode broadcast marathon, which I think we came through quite well. I'm going to add, as soon as the broadcast is over, the link to the Robert Merritt's testimony on the show also, which I highly recommend that you view that. And it all kind of comes together, I think, when we do it. So, Miss Olivia, fantastic. Well, you can take one more question.
Okay, I'm going to let Najat have last question. Does EJ think there will be any public announcement on the capsule before 2018 ends?
Well, not on the administration side, but we may be hearing more about the time capsule, the White House time capsule that Robert Merritt mentioned. We may be hearing more about it. Definitely.
By the way, Bo Krills thinks that you failed your recruitment by giving the wrong answer. So, good
I like
theory.
that.
The interpretation was there's kind of a reason for everything. Nothing's random. So.
No. If you read the work of J.G. Bennett, then you'll understand how the mystery schools work, and they don't hit you over the head. They show up in very obscure little ways, in obscure moments, and I think that people who've been around mystery school traditions, like Bennett was around Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, he understood that, and people who were around Steiner, they get the impression. The way I've described it before, so people understand it, is that someone wrote to me, as I've mentioned, and said, I think I was in a mystery school or something like that. It doesn't work like that. If you were in a mystery school, you'd know it. You'd be completely transformed. But there are levels of these schools. So you have the core, really major mystery school traditions, and those are pretty well hidden. Hold on. Mm-hmm. And then beneath that, you have levels. You have lesser schools, and that's a huge ring. And they shouldn't call them lesser schools because, of course, they're fantastic tradition and they hold incredible knowledge and advancement in methods and all the rest of it. And underneath that, you have arcane schools who maintain a tradition. It's not so much that the tradition grows, but you learn the tradition really well. Underneath that, you have public schools. No, you actually have private meeting groups around certain topics dealing with mystery school topics. And then finally, and this is about 98% of what people get recruited into, are the public interest groups around mystery schools. That's what is predominantly available. So those are the rings. And most people hit that ring. But, the thing is, when you get into it and you study it, then you kind of develop a magnetic center to kind of attract the rest. That's the way I would look at it. And it is a very worthwhile study. Okay.
It just occurred to me, do you think that they were signaling to you that you are being observed and that you could earn the right of being an initiate if you worked out your negative karma and kind of ironed out the wrinkles in your character?
It's very interesting.
I never thought about that before.
Well, I don't, I'll put it to you this way. I think there are always signals along the way in the work that you do. And I've never looked to a group to tell me who I was or anything like that. But I would say this. I think there are traditions of knowledge where if an individual is working on their own, it would take them like 5 years to discover a particular thing. But if they plug into a school of knowledge, then that accelerates that process dramatically, and they're able to absorb the information and utilize it for public benefit or for personal development. So the mystery schools are they call them mystery for a reason, and it's a great mystery of the mystery traditions. And you do have to, it is the kind of thing where you have to be very serious on the path. Let's put it to you that way. That would be the best way for me to answer that.
Cliff High wanted to add that initiates don't earn. Schools require that you find them and that you present yourself for admission.
Oh, I think that's true.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they do require that you find them. That's the whole thing about going through the labyrinth and all the rest of it. And if you look at Gurdjieff's story, look, he ran into so many dead ends looking for Sarmoon, and his life looked like it was going to be a tragedy because there he was in his late 20s. And he had spent all this time searching for Sarmoon, and it was kind of like, if you've ever read that book, it's one disappointment after another. But he knew that the tradition existed and that he eventually found what he was looking for. So in a way, it's almost metaphorical, because in our world, you know, with our everyday responsibilities and stuff, we can't go off and fly off to Crete or somewhere to find these mystery schools, but we can report on them from here. And thank God for that. Thank you, everyone. What a fantastic show. It's great to be here. And it was a huge turnout. And I think we're getting very close to something very special. I want to thank you, Miss Olivia. You did a fantastic job tonight with the questions. As usual, tomorrow night, Dr. Joseph Farrell and Mind Control and the Templars is our theme. We're going to go deep on the Templar X also. And Gigi Young gets the final quote there. The mysteries are within. I couldn't agree with you more. The only thing that's happening there with the mystery schools is they're trying to bring you to that consciousness of that mystery that lies within. And Gigi says it best. We will see you tomorrow night at 6 p.m. And thank you, everyone. I see we have a great crowd. If you want to do any shout outs, Daniel Natal is out there. Haven't seen you in a while. And of course, all the great questions tonight. Thank you so much. It's great to have you here, and we will see you tomorrow. The only question left, Olivia, is what's for dinner?
Chicken quesadilla and a tequila gimlet. I'm going for it. This trifecta has been intense, and I got to do what I got to do to get through it. I think
we call that the Christine special.
Yes, the Christine special.
We will see you all tomorrow night, everyone. Thank you. Stay safe.
All right. Good night, everybody.